so happy to have you,
Perfect.
Ramon. I wanted to just, I've been talking about you to all the students, so they all know who you are, but
Okay,
just
awesome.
as just as a refresher, Ramon is just I got so much out of Ramon's workshop that I took over all of the ones I've taken over the years. And, there's always a really fantastic art history segment that sets things, sets the tone of the whole workshop. And that's like always been my absolute favorite part. I've been really excited to share that experience with the dojo crew here and just, share in the really extensive knowledge you have on this subject. I also see that stunning painting in the background that I'm really excited to uh, have you share with everyone. Yeah,
Oh,
do you
thanks,
want
man.
to tell them about that?
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, just wanted to say, thank you, Nate, for having me, and thank you, Jennifer, and everybody at the school for, attending. Yeah, this will be fun. Um, Also, Meatball is happy to see everybody. He's going to be around. Possibly my other cat, Cooper. We'll see. But yeah, so here, let me go ahead and let's see. What's the gallery view? Or I guess I can do I'll do
Oh,
the.
it's connected here too. Sorry, I'm getting my speaker set up so we can hear
Oh,
you
no
over here.
worries. Here, let me just make this part big over here. Let's see, is that immersive? Full screen. Okay, there we go. Let me see. Oh
All
yeah, so
right.
yeah, the painting is in progress. I've been posting like bits of it on Instagram. We'll talk about it a little bit more, as our chat progresses. Although I do think it's funny that when you look at like a final painting, right? It's a lot like a movie. I've been watching a lot of just like little YouTube documentaries on like the making of like Alien, for instance, or other movies that are very like effects driven. And like when you're on set, like all of that stuff looks really silly, right? So like at the moment, I have a mannequin back here, and it's got just like a curtain draped on it, and that is basically for the drapery on this guy, which is the set of drapery that I'm going to be working on soon. The drapery that you see over the sarcophagus is just the drapery that's set up right now. Obviously, the mannequin, I'm using for this figure right now. So I had to move it from the position that it was in before. So in order to have like a stand-in for like shadows and stuff like that, currently there's just a cardboard tube there, right? And frankly, most of the time that's like all you need. You'll notice there is no real sarcophagus. It's just a bunch of plastic bins from Target, right? Half the time with this stuff, you're only like building like a little part of it, or it just has to look good from like one angle. But anyway, it demands a certain sort of like resourcefulness that it's pretty fun to put together. And I'm sure terrifying for the neighbors. As you can see, there are remnants of a mummy still here in studio, but and so we'll talk about that a little bit more as time goes on. So I guess we'll go ahead and get like started. Again, thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. Pretty excited about this. It's always a good day. We get to gossip about 19th century training, and I mean, the training part is fine. There's also just plenty of like very good, juicy, associated gossip, you know, and everyone's dead, so we can speak freely about all the little, the good and the bad. But anyway, the way that I try to run this sort of thing is I like for things to be like relatively informal, right? And so basically, if you have questions at any point about any of the stuff that we're talking about, I want this to be a session where, anything that you're like, that you've wondered about, in regard to, this kind of training and all that, hopefully we can provide some answers. And if I don't have the answer to one of your questions, then I'll try to find out, and I'll let Nate know, and then hopefully we can take care of that. So your end of the deal there is to ask any questions that you have. Don't be shy. Also, feel free to again run them through Nate or put them in the chat or anything like that. Don't wait till the end necessarily. Because otherwise, don't be afraid to interrupt parts of the presentation. Again, this is a very free-flowing sort of thing, and if you don't ask, I will just talk the entire time. So, if we interrupt the flow of it, that's fine. I think about this stuff way more than I should, so we'll be able to pick right back up to wherever we were.
Yeah.
So anyway, again. At any given point, any questions, feel free. Does that sound good? Do we have a deal?
Absolutely. Also, your setup is getting demolished right now.
Yeah,
So.
it'll be fine. There's a lesson in that. I actually haven't been letting them into the studio in the last couple of days because I've been painting the drapery, but it's mostly in there now. So you'd be surprised. At a certain point, if you have the really all you need for this stuff is an anchor, right? If you have the general color relationships established, if you have a drawing that's been made already, then small alterations, intentional or feline, are fine. You can usually maneuver yourself back to a position where nothing about these folds is going to change so substantially that I won't be able to get them back into place. However, I do have a little bit of insurance. I have a study that's good enough that I can work from it. So I would only need the setup for color reference because I also didn't realize how big Meatball is compared to the mummy, but he's a big boy. There's actually a cat bed under part of it.
He's like, dude, where's my house, right?
No, they have access. But I will say that as all of my friends thought that this was creepy and a bad idea, but what do they know? And I will say my cats have actually been very fond of when I'm not around, crawling on top of this thing and sleeping on it and all that. So he'll find his spot and he'll be happy enough there, cuddling up. The other thing is part of the mummy was made out of pillows, so I mean that's really my fault. They were their pillows first, so anyway, they're also fearless. I mean, cats respect nothing. The mummy, whatever, he doesn't care. So,
just a real quick, is this being recorded? Do you want me to? Do I have that up?
Yeah, I'm recording. I usually record locally because I hate the Zoom voice, the recording now thing. So
yeah, cool. Yeah, some students really want to be here, but they're not able to make it, and so they were curious about the option of watching the recording later. So.
Oh yeah. No, I'm recording the whole thing, and then I'll probably post it up eventually. But if you guys want it first or anything, then just let me know.
Yeah, awesome.
But I mean, just a quick little context / background. I first got interested in this stuff because I saw a bunch of 19th century narrative paintings, in books and online, and I imagine this is an experience that is fairly common to a lot of people that are in this sphere, where you look at a Waterhouse or something, or a Bouguereau or a Jerome or what have you, and it's just kind of flabbergasting for lack of a better term. It does seem almost impenetrable at first, where you're wait, how can someone make this, and where do you start, right? And I had the benefit of having access to a lot of great resources, a really great education, and mentors that were very interested in some of the same things that I was interested in, but there wasn't really a cohesive program to sort of tie things together, right? And I went to a 4-year university, so a lot of my time was spent skipping class but I was technically in the animation department. So I skipped a lot of class and would go painting instead, or would go take classes in the theater department, and learned about like costumes and, I took some architectural sketching and, life drawing classes outside the school and all of that. But a significant portion of the time was also spent in the art library trying to find anything I could, basically, about how people were taught in the past, right? And it was something that was useful. Again, it was to direct my own education. So there was always a goal around that, right? And this kind of narrative painting was like exactly the kind of thing that I wanted to make. And you'd be surprised, It's often treated as this sort of like, ancient aliens, Da Vinci Code, how do they build the pyramids kind of nonsense. But frankly, it's a lot less of a mystery than people think it is. It's any of the things involved in the production of a large narrative painting in the way that people painted those before is lost in the same way that when you lose your keys in your house, they're not lost. They're still around somewhere, right? They're just, there's just sort of like a mess, right? And so you'd actually be surprised at the amount of information that is available about literally every single aspect of what people did, in this period. And I imagine probably other periods too, but the time frame and the location that we're going to be looking at is about like 1860s going into the 1870s and 80s in Paris, right? Right around that time, France had, in Paris in particular, had really established itself as like the place to go for art training, right? And so people from all over the world were going to Paris, and it was fairly undisputed. The only other place at that time that was, even remotely on people's minds was Antwerp for a while, and then Munich for a little bit, right? But Paris retained its preeminence for a very long time, basically leading up to like World War I. But you would get people from, Latin America, from Turkey, from the United States, from Japan, from China, from, and from various like, European countries as well. People from all over the place were, coming to Paris, and, Paris is not like a huge place, right? And so it was this very interesting sort of like, melting pot of like a lot of people in this like, fairly small, dense, concentrated area, all with a fairly similar goal in mind. So anyway, that's, sort of the period that we'll be talking about. So I'm gonna go ahead here and share the screen. And what better place to start than Bohemian Paris of today? That is no longer today. This is a long ago today. This book was published, I think, in like 1900. Oh, actually, yeah, 1900 on the dot. And this is free online. You can just type in Bohemian Paris of today into Google. You'll get all the little illustrations that go along with this. The text is pretty light. It's a fun read.
Look at the cast.
What's that?
Just that cast on the wall is super famous.
Oh yeah, the unknown woman from the river. Let's see. So here's Bishop, I believe, was actually one of the students. So this is like just one student's like chronicles of like their student life, and they're all a bunch of like 20-somethings that are away from home for the first time, right? And so it's in some ways kind of similar to like the sort of American college experience that you see like in in movies and stuff, both the good and the bad. So anyway, there are sort of like some like staples of like Parisian life, the view from like the hotel window and all that. And here are some typical students of the Beaux-Arts, right? So you got your people with their pipes for smoking and their questionable facial hair and top hats and all that. Brother Musketeers of the Brush and a new model. There's there's a lot of fun, to be had in here. Also, plenty of this. This is a paintbrush duel at the Beaux-Arts, right? And you can read about that at your leisure. Here's the thing, part of the issue that I think comes up a lot, if you're someone, again, that's interested in like, representational painting or narrative art, I mean, pretty much at any scale, right? It is a pretty significant undertaking in terms of like the resources and the time and the, what it takes out of you, what it demands from you, right? And there is also, a couple of things make this harder, right? One is the access to information, and the other one is just the way that we conceive of artists and how we mythologize, like artists and art making. And so you get this idea where like you might see, some kind of like big fancy painting. Let's say, I imagine we're all probably, fairly visual creatures. So let's indulge in that for a second. So let's say that you look at something like this, right? Which is a Prix de Rome painting, not a winning painting, by the way, but just a, run-of-the-mill Prix de Rome painting from the 1870s. You might look at something like this, or, this one maybe. I think this one actually won the prize that year. Or, any number of these, and think, wow, the people that made this must have been extremely serious, showing this sort of like, monk-like devotion to their work, right? And just probably got up at 5 a.m. and did nothing but work the entire day and whatever. But that is not the case. These people were a bunch of morons. I mean, like, these are just like, I was this stupid when I was 20. Like, this is, they are not unlike the rest of us. You know what I mean? This is partly, the fact that so many people could attain such a high standard of achievement in a way that's like pretty uniform, actually, right? Now, granted, these are the people that competed for the Prix de Rome, right? So this, you might sort of think, well, yeah, but these are like the cream of the crop, the crème de la crème, some might say. But the thing is that like just a ton of people in these studios gained this, this ability to represent what they were looking at to like a really, significant degree, right? And the thing is that this is just like a basic literacy, like it's like a basic visual literacy, right? And so in the same way that you can teach pretty much everybody how to read, you can teach pretty much anybody how to do this. It's just that why is it that we have near universal literacy? Well, it's because governments worldwide tend to invest fairly significant resources into teaching people how to read. Well, France during this period was investing a lot of money into this. So you have a school that is free and accessible to not everyone, we'll get into that later, but is by and large fairly accessible. And what a surprise that when you create these conditions, people are able to learn. A huge shock, I can see it on everyone's faces as we speak. But in any case, let's back up for a second here. We're throwing out a bunch of names, a bunch of terms. First of all, what is the Ecole de Beaux-Arts? Okay, because sometimes people will say like, oh yes, the French Academy. Well, yes and no, right? Depends on what people mean by that. So basically, after the French Revolution, you have two separate bodies, right? You have the French Academy, right? And the Academy, at least as far as the arts are concerned, the Academy is basically like, how in the US we have the Academy of Sciences, or we have like the Academy of Motion Pictures, and it's not a school, it's a professional association. That's what the French Academy is after the Revolution, right? So there's the French Academy, that's the Académie des Beaux-Arts, right? And that's the Academy of Fine Arts. And then you have the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, it literally just means School of Fine Arts, right? But it is a separate thing from the Academy. So the Academy is basically, France's premier group of professional artists, and over here is the government-run school. Now, the people that taught at the school were often members of the Academy. They were often the same people, right? But on paper, these two bodies were separate, right? So, I mean, if you hear someone talking about, 19th century training, and they're like, oh yes, the French Academy, there's already some gaps in their understanding of like the period and how things were set up, right? So in any case, when we talk about the Ecole or the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, we're literally it's just the School of Fine Arts, and usually we're talking about the one in Paris, because pretty much every major French city has one, right? There's the Ecole des Beaux-Arts in I think Nancy has one. There's one in Lille. There's one in just any number. There's one in Lyon. There's any number of major cities, right? But again, the one that we're usually talking about, at least in this context, is the one in Paris. And funny enough, I mean, for a long time, you wouldn't really learn how to paint there or how to sculpt or anything like that. It was just a place that you would go and you would be able to attend a drawing class and get some other supplementary classes, in like, costume, perspective, etc., right? But your major training would happen, in some other studio outside of the school, right? Basically, the way that would work, and, we'll come back to this more a little later, but effectively, if you were a student prior to 1863, what would happen is, there would be some famous painter, and, they would have not their studio, but a studio open for students, right? For instance, like, let's say, like, take a well-known one, the painter Ingres, right? So, for instance, he had a studio, right? And it was next to his own studio. Now, a lot of these artists would teach for free, right? They saw it as sort of part of their responsibility, almost like a civic duty, right? And so what would happen is that generally the students were the ones that set up, the studio. They had to, split between themselves the cost of like the models. They had to book the models. They had to, basically they were running like the whole thing, right? And they would like rent the place and all that. The teacher would donate their services, but they would just come by like twice a week, basically, or once a week, or whenever they felt like it. Ingres was famous for like coming actually like a bit more often, but anyway. So you would work from like about like 8 a.m. to like 1 p.m. or noon, right? So like 4 or 5 hours in the mornings. It would vary sometimes from studio to studio, and depending on whether it was winter or summer, right? And, in the studio in the morning, that's when, the people who were studying painting, right? That's when all of these academic paintings would be done. Students that were not as far along would be drawing in there, but in the same room, right? Then in the afternoon, you could basically go do whatever you want. Some people would work on homework, because in a lot of these places, composition would be, assigned as homework. You might go copy some stuff at the Louvre, etc. And then potentially, if you had tested in to the Ecole, then you might go to their evening drawing class, which was not like really in the evening. I think it's like late afternoon. In France, like after the late afternoon, they just call it soir, which is like evening. But it was like from 4 to 6 p.m., generally. So you'd go there for a class, and, that was only in drawing, right? And then some people would go maybe for another class, like in at actual nighttime, right? But again, the schedule wasn't as heavy as people might think. You're doing 4 to 5 hours in the morning. You could just stop after that. Or you could potentially, go in the evening for another class, and then, maybe one more after that if you were feeling especially ambitious. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now, eventually what happened is, the people at they restructured the Ecole in 1863, and they said, well, they had this fancy, building under construction, which was a former monastery, right? And so, they had all this room. They had a little, they had a little chapel attached to it with a bunch of copies of Michelangelo. And they still have this, by the way. These are contemporary photographs. Anyway, so they had, this is the outside of the chapel. This is part of the school. So after 1863, they're like, you know what? Why don't we just have studios literally at the school, right? So they set up 3 studios, and they installed 3 painters there, and I think I forget how many sculptors, and they had some architecture ones too, and some stuff from engraving or whatever. But basically, at this point, you didn't have to get your actual drawing and painting training outside of the school. You could get everything just right in one place, right? Now, you didn't have to, right? You could still go and, if there was a painter that you liked more, you could still go study with them and, then potentially test into the evening classes and all the supplementary stuff at the Ecole, right? That was still an option that you had open to you. But again, the Ecole, everything was, free. So it was, it was tempting, I'd say for a lot of people. There was a lot of prestige, sort of associated with the school. So anyway, what did it look like when someone joined the school? What was that like? Well, again, thankfully we have plenty of information about that. So basically, you would, since we said there were basically 2 aspects to the school, right? You had the studios in the morning, and then you had the evening classes and all of that stuff. Well, to join the studios in the morning, all you had to do was basically kind of just show up. People would track down some of the teachers, right? Sometimes they would just show up to the studio with a letter of recommendation or something like that. And basically, if the teacher had room, they'd be like, all right, come on in. And often, it kind of, maybe you'd present a portfolio or something, but it was pretty informal. Sometimes if the teacher just liked you, or you had a recommendation from someone they knew, or if there was just room, they might just let you in, right? And so there wasn't a big exam for that. Some people came in with basically no experience. Some people came in with plenty of experience. Some of them had gone to little regional schools and stuff, and going to the Beaux-Arts was almost like a formality, for some of them. This is what one of the studios looked like, by the way. It just packed full of 50 to 60 people in each of those places. You'll notice there's no site size. There's no oh, everybody gets their own little cast station and whatever. No, there's none of that. It's the French government was like, okay, we're going to give you this for free, and you're going to get what you get, and you figure it out. And that's what people did, and it worked great. Also, you'll notice that these people are smoking in class. That was a thing. Several of them are smoking in class. So sometimes when you look at some of these paintings from that period, and you see this kind of smoky haze, particularly, let's see, there's a good one here. See, that might be dust, or it might be just atmosphere, or it could just literally be smoke, from 50 to 60 people that are in close quarters with you. So there are some reports that if you were someone who was sitting in the back or standing in the back, it might be kind of hard to see the model, because there is a cloud of smoke from your other fellow students, preventing you from seeing. There's even some stories that the people way far in the back, sometimes, if you got there late or couldn't get a good spot, you wouldn't even really be able to see the model. You would be drawing or painting, copying off of someone else's thing. Now, again, got to take some of these stories with a grain of salt, right? But it gives you a little clue as to what the environment was like that you were coming into. Now, this is a more distant aspiration, but if you eventually wanted to go for the gold, then you might try to get into the evening class. You'll notice the evening class is set up differently. It has, had like these big gas lamps, and eventually they had like electric lights in there. This is the class that you had to test into, right? So there's like a 2-week exam to get into this class, and only the top 70 to 80 students were allowed to be in this one, right? This one was taught for a long time by literally just one guy, right? This guy's Adolphe Yvon. More on him in a second. But, morning studios, you could almost just walk in. Evening class, very difficult to get in. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
So again, and this is only a 2-hour class, right? And in this class you had to be quiet, and they had like guards, and they had like all this, all this stuff. Over here, it was basically just pandemonium. It's like, yes, people were, fairly studious at times, but the way that classes were set up, or like a posing session was set up, is the model would pose for an hour and then get 15 minutes of break. Which you'll notice is the same breakdown that we tend to have now, which is like 20 minutes of posing and 5 minutes of rest, right? But with them, it happens all at once. So if the model's posing for an hour and then you get 15 minutes of rest, 15 minutes is a long time. 15 minutes is enough time that, you might be able to get, into some trouble in those 15 minutes, and trouble they got into, right? So this is what they called le blague, which is just like a prank or hazing. This is what you could expect as a new student of the Beaux-Arts. It's like your parents see you off, maybe you're an American, and you're like this, prim and proper, young, painter of industry. You go to church every Sunday. You dress up real nice. Your studio's clean. And then about a year later, you turn into a degenerate bohemian. And your paint palette is hung up over here, and you are screwing around with a fiddle and smoking a cigarette, and almost burning up your salmon-colored cravat, right? So, and is this an isolated incident? This is Thomas Hovenden, an Irish-American painter. Is this an isolated incident? Well, you tell me. This is a set of portraits done by 2 roommates. This is before using, after using. What are they using? They didn't say. But, there's something about like reading into this stuff that you find that people from the 1800s, it wasn't that long ago, and they are not so very different from people today. So, in any case, there are plenty of things like this that you can find. And, funny enough, so the way that this worked, let's just, pretend for a second. Let's say that you are, looking to go to, study with like your favorite, French academic painter, or, just have this dream of going to Paris, and it's, the 19th century. And so you make your way there, you have your little letter of introduction, or you chase down an unsuspecting professor, at a cafe, and you just beg to get into the school or into their studio, and they say, all right, fine, show up, see if there's room. Okay, fine. What you could expect is that you would start in the antique. Now, the antique basically looked like this. The Ecole des Beaux-Arts is nothing if not a kind of Disneyland for art nerds, right? So like in the, they have several courtyards, and they have this big building called the Palace of Studies, right? The Palace of Studies is, basically this place. And here, let's see if we can find like a modern photo of it. see, pull up ye old Google here. So this is, yeah, this is pretty much what the Ecole looks like. Right, so here, this is the Palace of Studies. The chapel's over here, bathrooms over here, and there used to be this like enormous like just like random Roman fragments, like columns and stuff like that. I believe some of those things they've given back now, but you know, that's pretty much what it looks like. This is the gate outside. You know, you have I think it's a sculpture of there's a bust of Nicolas Poussin and Pierre Puget, who are sort of like the, you know, the big like Baroque luminaries of French painting and sculpture. Oh yeah, look, yeah, there's like this like Roman column thing. I think that's what this is. That was just kind of hanging out like in the middle of the school. And again, they have like a little shrine to like Michelangelo, you know, in the chapel. You know, so there's that as well. And then this is the interior of the Palace of Studies. Again, they used to have this large column thing, and it used to be full of casts. Today, it looks like this. It was always painted, by the way. Like, it wasn't like this, like, you know, white marble building. And it's always had this, like, you know, really impressive, like, you know, wrought iron, you know, like big glass skylight thing. So the glazed courtyard is what they call it. And these days, it's more of like an exhibition space. You know, they have like, you know, every time I've been there, there was one time that it was empty, but at many other times there's been like some kind of like installation, you know, like just something happening in there. So yeah, like yeah, stuff like this, or like, I don't know, popsicle stick sculptures, or, you know, whatever else. So in any case, you would basically be let loose on the school. So, you know, you could, for instance, like go to the courtyard in the Palace of Studies and just set up, you know, at, you know, you'd grab one of these little stool things. There were no drawing horses back then. You would just grab like a little chair. That was your, you know, easel or stool, or, you know, drawing horse or whatever. And then the other one was for sitting, right? And so, you know, you just set up your portfolio like that. Eventually, you know, the teacher of your choice would come and find you. You could be set up, like I said, in the glazed courtyard. You could also be in the chapel. So, you know, maybe, well, actually, I guess the glazed courtyard was covered, so even if it rained, you could be in there. But let's say you really, really want to copy a Michelangelo sculpture instead, then you can just go into the chapel and try your luck in there. Again, notice the same setup, you know, just like a little chair and a stool to sit on. You know, possibly some apparition, you know, would interfere with your studies, you know, in this, you know, weirdly condemning sort of way. Who knows, right? Again, that may be after using, but in any case, so you would basically just try your luck and see what happened. And again, eventually, you know, the teacher of your choice would, you know, possibly make an appearance. Here is Jerome. Jerome was pretty devoted to his students. You know, he would show up twice a week. I believe he would show up on Tuesdays and Saturdays. So they work like six-day weeks, right? So Tuesday, basically he would show up like a day after you had started what you were working on, because most of these things were done like in the span of a week. So on Tuesday, he'd come to see how you did on the first day. Saturday, he'd come and offer final thoughts on how you would finish up your thing. And then that would, you know, be, you know, sort of advice that you would have in mind as you start on, you know, the next Monday. So, you know, here he is dispensing some advice to one student. Here he is with Shorty Lazar. Shorty Lazar was an American painter. He actually published like a small book on art instruction that you can still find today. If anyone's interested, I can, you know, send out stuff for that. Here they're talking about, there's a story associated with this. Basically, Jerome had come by, you know, he saw the drawing that Shorty Lazar had done, and he didn't think much of it. So Shorty Lazar, being a very pragmatic, industrious young American, invented something to get the angles right for his drawing. So he basically made like a little viewfinder thing, right? But he had a string attached to it. So you'd set up a little viewfinder like this, looking at the sculpture, and he would basically like pull the string, in the direction of whatever the angle was, and then transfer it over to his paper, right? So what happened here is that when Jerome came around, he looked at the drawing, he sat down, he like looked at it again, took out his plumb line, was measuring, was checking, and he said, well, the drawing's still terrible, but the angles are perfect. Raphael himself could not do any better. And so one of the guards was here listening to that, and all he heard was, this kid draws better than Raphael. So then he went and told people, and so it became a rumor around the school, and then some of the older students were like, oh, okay, well, who's this kid who's drawing like Raphael, and whatever, right? So they came down, they saw the drawing, and they saw that it was just kind of like, weird hype and whatnot. But, the school was a place, full of, gossip and intrigue. So, in any case, this is what one of those drawings might look like. This is of the same sculpture. This one was done by Kenyon Cox, who was another American artist. These are all people basically around Sargent's generation. Some of these people were Sargent's friends. Kenyon Cox, he definitely knew. Kenyon Cox is basically the whiniest mama's boy imaginable. So if you ever read his letters, they're called An American Art Student in Paris. It is very, very fun reading. So, we'll come back to him again more as time goes on. But he did eventually make his way out of the antique with a study after Michelangelo. Now, it could have been this one, or it could have been, there's another one, let's see, where is that one? There's another candidate that could have possibly been the drawing that got him out of the antique. But it wasn't necessarily a thing where you would spend like years drawing from the sculptures, right? Some people just spent like a couple weeks down there. You might spend a couple months. Who knows? It was just kind of like up to your teacher. But it wasn't really, the ethos here was not you do something until it's perfect and then you move on to the next thing and you do that until it's perfect. That's really not at all how it worked for them. It was basically you do something until it's, reasonably, sort of good enough, and then they move you up to the next task. And, if you're having a hard time, then they always reserve the right to send you right back, right? So it could have been this one, but I kind of doubt it. My feeling is that it was probably this drawing that got him in. Now, again, you might look at this and think like, wow, that's really impressive. And sure, it's a pretty good drawing, right? But when you get up close, like, does that look like the kind of modern cast drawings that people are doing today? Does that look like the sort of laborious 100+ hour cast drawings that people do? No, because they didn't do that. That wasn't a thing in France at the time, right? And so what you see is like a, charcoal and Conte, and like stump drawing. It's, basically done in a really efficient, way without any real sort of like wasted labor. It's done on like inexpensive laid paper. But, again, that's something that we'll get into, a little bit later. Now, the interesting thing about Kenyon Cox is, again, he documents all of the struggles, and believe me, struggles there were, at the school. You would basically be presented with some ideas, but in the beginning, you were kind of, you're kind of on your own, right? And you would learn from other students and, et cetera. And so Kenyon Cox, when he got started, this is one of the casts that he was working from. You can see him struggling. You can see him going through this over and over, trying to get like the actual movement, the actual tilt of this cast, right? And you can see that he was, he was trying out the stump. It's a little patchy. He wasn't using enough charcoal, quite yet. So he didn't like that, so he tried it again, right? You can still see that it was a bit of a struggle for him, right? But he's hanging in there. And this is typical of French academic drawings, by the way. These were not the sort of like, I make a perfect outline and then, I fill it in with like little little dots, my like sharpened little pencil or whatever. That is not what this was. Eventually, he started getting, better at tying things together. You can see the stumping is much more uniform. The, kind of the feeling of the form overall is more cohesive. He's still breaking this up into too many things. He's still working a little too hard for each little bit of this, but he is making progress, right? And then eventually, you get to this. And now he was like one of those people that goes to like a yoga studio and then quits and then goes to another one, right? So he bounced around from from one studio to another one, etc. There would be like these purges sometimes where if a studio got too crowded or if it was too rowdy, then, the authorities might be like, you know what, we're going to clear out this studio. We're going to, the teacher has to get rid of 20 people in here. So basically, Kenyon Cox got booted out of a studio at the Ecole in one of those purges. So he had to go back to the Antique and try to get back into another one of the studios. He eventually got into Jerome's. So these drawings might be from his first go around, but you can see that, he's getting the hang of it in some areas, but then there's other stuff that's just, really sort of cut to pieces, right? His attention on, for instance, the legs of this model, his attention's scattered all over the place. He's doing a little bit of modeling, he's doing a little bit of the outline, he's doing a little bit of the initial block in, and it doesn't produce a kind of unified, consistent effort yet. Over here, he is learning how to use a stump. He bit off more than he could chew, right? So by working all over like this, he doesn't have time to devote enough attention to each one of these, forms. And so as a result, you get something that's really patchy. He was getting the hang of it in some areas, but again, it was something of a struggle for him. Now again, depending on the circumstances, sometimes you might just, go in directly into life drawing. They might not even, you might not even have to go through the antique or whatever. Here are some other drawings by Douglas Volk, who was another artist of around the same age, same time. He was also a student of Jerome. Now, by the way, at this time, models would just basically show up at the door of the school. Let's see. I believe we have a thing for that. So models would gather around. Hold on, let me just see if we can find that. Here we go. So this is Italian models in front of Colorossi's. The Academy Colorossi was basically it was a bit of an open studio for a while, but it was one of the private academies that was, sort of competition for the big free government school, right? But at the Ecole de Beaux-Arts, the same thing happened, where models would gather outside the gates and they would come in and audition on Mondays, to be chosen for a week of modeling. And the thing is that there were absolutely no child labor laws back then, right? And so what you would get is entire families showing up. Oh, actually, I lost the... What is it? Cola... Oh, no. Where'd they go? 1 second. Here we go. So you would have, elderly folks. You would have little kids. This lady has a baby, right? And the way that it worked back then is everyone would get paid the same. Man, woman, child, everyone made the same amount of money. And so they had this very silly idea in France and in England that Italian people looked the most like Greek sculptures. And so so there was this really bizarre thing where they would say stuff like, no amount of labor seems to spoil the beauty and grace of their hands and feet. And so basically a lot of working class Italian immigrants would go into modeling and they would bring the whole family, right? And so, effectively, again, you would get entire generations all working, all contributing to the household, again, making the same amount of money. So that's why you get studies like this where like periodically you just have like little kids in here. Now, this is a, not an especially impressive drawing by Douglas Volk. Douglas Volk came with like very little experience. But, after a while, he did some drawings from the antique. You'll notice that this wasn't a sort of thing where it's like, all right, you have to make a perfect block in and you have to block in every single thing imaginable when you're making this before you get the privilege of moving on to, modeling the form or whatever. No. What he was learning was he was learning how to basically sculpt on paper. He was learning how to construct. And so this is like a really low resolution, drawing, let's say. He didn't know a whole lot, but, he could at least figure out that, an arm is going to have a front and a side and a back plane, right? He's learning about space. He's, I'm sure the angles were probably fairly accurate because that was the thing that was also insisted on. And so you get a study that's not especially detailed, but it is carried from start to finish, right? So anyway, and I imagine that this will start to seem pretty familiar to some of you, now that Nate's been introducing you to it. So this is basically, you'd put out some charcoal or some Conte, and then you'd grab that with the stump. This is basically like your palette, and then you would apply that to your drawing, right? But look, this is a drawing by Douglas Volk shortly thereafter, right? And so you can see that, after a little bit of time, the system works, right? And so even starting out from, this, which, I don't think, for people who believe in talent, I'm not one of them, but, I don't think it would show very much promise. This is a very sort of, standard, life drawing. This is like the sort of thing that you would see in like, any basically a college classroom today. However, after not very much time, you start to get some, pretty sophisticated work, and this little marking here, and these are markings from a contest. So he must have actually done pretty well to actually even get a number. This is by, I forget this guy's name, but he was another American artist. Now this is about, he came in with pretty much no experience. He was a student of Léon Bonnat, who maintained an independent studio at this time. So this wasn't done at the Ecole, but the training was basically the same. And, he came in with like very little experience. This is, after about a year of work, I believe, because I'm pretty sure these are both from 1874, and that's like the year that he went to Paris. So again, in pretty short order, people would get pretty damn good at this, right? And so how, well, before we get into, a bit of the how, we'll take a break in a second just to let you digest the information. But before we do that, let's just say that you did a study from the antique. You've been grinding in there, working at your own pace, making some of these studies. Eventually, Jerome comes around and gives you the go-ahead to go to the upstairs, right? So basically, up here, these rooms up here, that's where the studios were. And so you had to, go up the staircase, open the doors, come on in and meet, your 50 to 60, comrades in arms in here, right? And when a new person arrived, they would start yelling and say, nouveau, nouveau, right? Which means like freshman or like new person. And then this would happen. So this is the Atelier Jerome going out to drink at the nouveau's expense. If you got off easy, you might have to buy drinks for your 50 to 60 new best friends at the school, okay? What they would drink was this disgusting thing called American grog, which was rum, hot water, and lemon, okay? And what they would eat, if there was like a little bit more money going around, were chausson aux pommes which is basically what McDonald's calls their apple pies in France to this day. So it's like apple turnovers, right? Which, again, I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty close to my experience as a student, actually. So there are some things that, don't seem to change very much over time. So anyway, that was if you got off easy. As the new person, you had to wash everyone's brushes. You were on call for errands to maybe like restock the stove and, get more coal or whatever else, the others, the anciens, might need. Ancien means like old. They're basically just like the elder students. And but let's say that you got there on a bad day. Maybe there are two of you new people, right? So then they might make you, strip down and sing a song. Or if there are two of you, they might make you have a paint duel like the one pictured here, right? The paint duel might look like this. The paint duel might look like that. Again, those 15-minute breaks, that's a long time. This guy is the one whose memoirs this is all from. This is John Shirley Fox. These are, again, available online, completely free, very fun read. What he did is, even though he was a teenager, he outsmarted everybody. He just took a really long time to take off his shoes. And so in that time, he ran out the clock, and then it was time to work again. So he didn't have to do, any of the prank stuff, right? By the way, notice this. These were stools where they cut off the legs. So these are the people that sat at the very, very front. Again, very resourceful. There was nothing really that fancy about these studios. Now, let's say that you came in on a really bad day, right? And, potentially you could run into what they called le fer rouge. Now, fer rouge means the red iron, okay? I thought this was a myth for a long time, but there is yet another book of memoirs from an Ecole student named Alexis Lemastre, and he chronicles a lot of stuff that happened at the school. One of them is an incident where a student was basically made to strip down, and then they took out the red iron. Now, this iron is it's a poker that you would use to like shift the coals around in the coal stove that they use to heat the studio, right? To keep the model warm. So basically what they did is they took the poker out and they bring it up to the guy, and it's coming, and it's coming, and it's coming. The guy closes his eyes, and the thing makes contact. And when it makes contact, to brand him, it's cold. And so you think like, okay, well, like what happened, right? Sometimes, when you experience like severe pain, your nerves kind of go haywire, right? And you can't really tell if something is hot or cold or whatever. So maybe that's what happened, but no. What happened in this case is that the red hot iron is a decoy. It is just painted with vermilion. So the steel is cold. They were just screwing with this person, right? And so that is the kind, welcoming humor that you could expect from one of these places. Needless to say, the government would shut down these studios sometimes for months at a time as punishment. Sometimes the police would be called. The neighbors often complained about the painting studios. And Jerome's was one of like the worst offenders, apparently. So, anyway, I would say that's probably one of the studio traditions that is not worth reviving. Your mileage may vary, but, I don't think we need any more of that. Anyway, is that all making sense so far? Okay, great. Then let's go ahead and take like a little 5-minute break. I'll let you kind of, sit back and digest, some of this stuff for a minute, and then we'll come back. Okay?
Hey, Ramon, we had a question.
Oh yeah.
So you talked about, the hall where people would just go draw from the cast,
Mm-hmm.
not really supervise too much, but the teacher would
Yeah.
pop in, and then, there would eventually they would be sent to the model room. What is a typical, I guess, timeline? I know it varies person to person,
Mm-hmm.
but what would be like kind of the seems to be the general rhythm for that process?
So it it does depend. Like a lot of it was like up to like the teacher's discretion. Like when when you ran a studio, like one of the three painting studios at the Ecole, you basically have like absolute authority as the teacher, right? And so, for instance, like there were people like Albert Edelfelt, who we'll talk about in a little bit. He had like a certificate from the academy at Antwerp, right, in Belgium, and he'd had like plenty of experience. So I think they just like let him skip the antique, right? But for other people that were coming into that, again, it could be a couple of weeks, it could be a couple of months, but it's like maybe somewhere around there. I
There
don't.
weren't any anecdotes of people there for like years and years or anything that you
No,
are
no,
aware of.
not
Okay.
not that particularly. They're probably one of the best documents to read is Julian Alden Weir's letters. He was like a friend of Sargent's. He was a student of Jerome. Um, he for a little while he got into a fight and he like basically got booted out of Jerome's studio for like a little bit, right? And so he went to study with this other guy. I forget the guy's name, but in any case, when he went to study with this other artist, he was saying that, oh, you should like study from the cast for years and years until it was perfect. And so what Julian did is Julian would write back to his brother John, because his brother at this time was the dean of the art school at Yale, right? And basically they wanted to create a little Ecole de Beaux-Arts in Connecticut. So his brother was like asking him to spill all the tea about like what he was learning and how they were doing this and how they were doing that. And so in talking about that, he was like, oh yeah, he said something like they keep you like at the drawing from the plasters for like some, reasonable amount of time, not the damned insane ideas of, Jacques Casson was the guy's name. The damned insane ideas of Jacques Casson of drawing from the plasters for years on end. So this wasn't like, this wasn't a sort of thing where they were just like trying to keep you like, drawing from the antique forever. But part of the way that it worked is, you would start from some kind of a cast, right? And if you went to like another place like the Académie Julian, which was a private alternative to the Ecole, it would be very much the same, right? Where like from there you might start from like a plaster cast of like a head or like a figure or something, right? You did a good enough drawing, then you were moved up to drawing from the model. Again, it wouldn't necessarily take years or anything like that. By this point, there was no drawing from the flat. There was no drawing from prints. There was no drawing from like the Bard course. There was none of that. Drawing from the Bard course and that sort of thing was generally reserved for like kids, people in trade schools, people in regional schools, and they seemed to sell it to foreigners too, right? So at least in Paris proper, the consensus at the time was that most teachers thought it didn't really teach you a whole lot, so they weren't really like interested in that. The main thing, sort of like in terms of their teaching philosophy, was that it was largely about like ideas. Like your teachers generally did not care how you did something. They cared that you, understood like the character of the model, that you captured the movement of the model, that you captured the color, the value, the construction, etc. But how you did it wasn't really like a huge priority for them. Material manipulation, generally speaking, was not something that they talked about a lot, unless it was something where like you could make your life easier, by doing something, right? So generally the methods that they practiced, funny enough, were fairly standard and fairly universal, not because teachers were like imposing a certain way of working, but because this is kind of like the minimum sort of like, best practices, like easiest way to do certain things. But actually, in relation to that, here, let's go ahead and share the screen. And we will go to one of Julian Aldenweir's letters, which I think pretty much addresses this. Here, okay. So in this letter, which is part of like part of a larger letter, this is from 1875. So Julian Aldenweir is talking to his brother John, right? And he says, "You ask about the manner of study at the Beaux-Arts Ecole. Each student that enters goes to the antique until he draws a tolerably fair figure and then directly to the life. Not the damn insane ideas of Jacques Casson keeping a person for several years at the plasters." So, okay, there's the quote. "And when one draws tolerably well from the life, which is of course to be judged by the professor, then he goes to painting by doing only a part, a head, an arm, a torso, etc. And what is a great merit of the strength of the French art is that the student has his palette and color and studies to paint what he sees without any receipt or Mother Goose's remedy, or in other words, to represent what he sees honestly with solid painting." So effectively here, what they're talking about is that, and this is a word that comes up a lot, tolerably well, tolerably fair, right? Not perfect. Not until something is like, just beyond reproach or whatever, but basically good enough is good enough, right? And funny enough, there's another text over here. There's a big debate in England at around the same time because the English always kind of had one eye to France. There's a long-standing rivalry there. And so what happened is that in England, they would have people working on a single cast for like 5 months, right? And so what happened is their students started leaving and going to Belgium or to Paris to study instead. So the English sent a couple of like commissions out there to basically like spies almost to like investigate what was going on. And, there were a number of artists, English artists, that studied in France and then came back and tried to reform the way the drawing was done in England. So this is in reference to Edward Armitage. Edward Armitage was he was a painter who studied with Delaroche, basically the same teacher that Gérôme had. And he was a little bit older than Gérôme, so, they weren't necessarily there at the same time, but they learned the same things from the same teacher, right? And funny enough, Armitage was actually one of the students that that helped Delaroche paint the hémicycle. So the hémicycle at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts is basically this circular mural, which is effectively just fan art. It's like let's see if this is a big image of it. It's basically fan art. It's like a scene happening in heaven, right? Where everyone's favorite artists are hanging out and they're all pals, right? Except for Michelangelo because he's, being a sad boy over here off to the side. If you look at one of these close-ups, here you've got like a figure of it's like a figure of victory, crowning art with laurels or something. Let's see, maybe we'll just do like search by large images here. There's plenty of images, but most of them are not very great quality. Let's see. No, this is the other side panel. Oh, actually, no, this is a good one. Oh, actually, we'll go ahead and open it this way. Unfortunately, a lot of the images that you find for stuff like this are like from websites that want to sell you like poster reproductions or whatever. But yeah, check this out. So here's Rubens and his boy Van Dyke, and they're having a chat with Titian. Velasquez is giving a very saucy, spicy look from back here. I believe this is Raphael, And then again, somewhere over here on the side is like Michelangelo looking sad. So in any case, the Edward Armitage was one of the people who helped Delaroche to paint this, right? So Edward Armitage is as qualified as anybody, to talk about the training at the Ecole de Beaux-Arts, because he's literally one of the guys that helped to decorate the room where they give out awards. You know what I mean? So, what more do you want? But actually, speaking of wants, you can actually find Edward Armitage, the lectures on painting that he gave to the students at the Royal Academy in England, right, in his later years. You can not only find those for free online, there's actually an audiobook version, right? So here, I guess you can't, maybe you can't access it right from here, but let's see. Edward Armitage, it's LibriVox Lectures Painting. And here we go. And so they did a really good job with this, by the way. So, if you're in the mood to listen to a new audiobook and, you want someone with a very pleasant English accent to read out these lectures for you, then, I'll send you the link and you can go right ahead and do that. But, the stuff that is in here about, a lot of this is like, stuff that's honestly pretty useful. It's not the sort of standard fare of like art instruction that you might expect. Like there's a lot of history, there's quite a bit of philosophy. There's also just like stuff on ancient costumes. But if you want, more of like the meat and potato stuff, his lecture on drawing is really good. The one on composition of decorative and historical pictures is really good. The one on finish is good too. Actually, like a lot of these are really good. Again, very fun read. But the reason why I brought him up was because in one of these articles, I guess this is more of a book, but they're talking here about, let's see. There never is a time when a painter can afford to leave off studying pure form. Even if he is given over entirely to landscape, he ought to keep studying the figure in line and, if possible, on a large free scale. The French use of charcoal is admirable in work of this kind, and their system, as recommended by Mr. Armitage, that's Edward Armitage, appears less mechanical and more artistic than our own, which was originally established, rather, with a view to training pupils to applied art for commercial purposes than with the idea of making painters. In the great French ateliers, the elaborate chalk stippling being like literally creating shading by like, hitting the paper with little dots, does not occupy so much time as in England. Time is devoted, rather, to continual and extremely accurate study of form by means of straight lines. The English students do not draw square enough, say our neighbors. That is to say, they spend time on texture, and the toil of stippling and hatching really produces little more. Instead of close, continual measurement and calculation of distances and angles and patient triangulation of the model. Nicety and judgment of pitch and flatness of shade may come after. All a pupil's time, till he can produce something worthy of high finish, ought to be spent in study of line and in storing his ocular memory with facts and observations of subtle form, etc., etc. It is quite true, on the other hand, that the facts of surface form are best learned, perhaps can only be learned, by long practice in shading, but it ought to be of significant shade indicative of form or structure. And this is a point that'll come up a lot. The materials for study in use in French schools are charcoal and a paper stump for blending lines together or for taking out half-lights. Bread rolled into a pencil point is used to remove highlights, as in chalk drawing, and the work when finished is set by an application of mastic varnish on the back of the paper. They stopped doing that after a while. They didn't have like the technology to spray varnish or to spray fixative on drawings at the time, so they used to brush it on the back of the drawing and let it soak to the front. They eventually figured out atomizers, which is like what we would know sort of as a spray bottle, except that you had to blow through it like with your mouth. Like there wasn't like, the handle technology was not developed to that degree yet. Eventually they figured it out. But anyway, so they would use bread for erasing, right? And it says, this paper, blah, 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 the back of the paper, which is quite soft and spongy. This paper is always to be had at Le Chartier and Barbès in the Quadrant. The main lines, once obtained by careful calculation of the various distances and scrupulously exact square drawing or blocking out in straight lines, the charcoal is hatched on and rubbed with the stump and finger to tolerable evenness of half tint over the main shades, and the work is then carefully gone over, every light in the copy being faithfully rubbed out with bread or the stump, and the stronger darks added afterwards. So, that was a lot of talking, but what are they saying? Well, effectively, that you would hatch on charcoal, right? Rub it with a stump, and basically apply a half tone over, like, you know, the main shades. And then with an eraser, you would take out the lighter parts and then add darker accents afterwards, right? Which is pretty similar to how to how a lot of people paint, right? It is much easier and faster to, let's say, you know, when you have someone's arm, which, you know, flesh is not that shiny. It tends to be actually fairly even in tone. So it's pretty easy to rub a single tone over all of the lights and then come in and erase, you know, whatever smaller highlights are there, you know, or put in whatever darker halftones are there, you know, basically season it, right? Rather than shading everything all the way up to the highlights, shading little halftones skirting around the highlights that you can barely even see, right? And so, in any case, you'll notice that word tolerable coming up a lot, right? Because a lot of how they saw things was basically, you know, they weren't really obsessed with like manual work and like manual labor, right? For French work, for the most part, everything was in the thinking, not so much in the actual doing, right? The manual aspect of drawing and painting was basically something that you had to, you know, get over with as quickly as possible. You know, it's like delivering a good speech. You know what I mean? Where it's like you basically just think about what you want to say and then you just say it, right? As directly as possible with as few words or as few interruptions, as few obstacles between, you know, your idea and the public as, you know, is compatible with, you know, communicating what you want to communicate. Does that make sense? So there's a kind of like economy of effort there. So does that, and hopefully that answers the, you know, the question to some degree. If anybody has any more questions, again, let me know.
I have a question.
Sure.
If you can hear me. The teachers.
Uh-huh.
So, okay, you mentioned Jerome and some of the other teachers of the school.
Yeah.
Were they like? I'm under the impression that the Beaux-Arts started at a certain time, and there were certain teachers that were already established professionals, and so they were hired to teach.
Yeah.
And so I assume, I mean, they came from slightly different methodologies and ateliers and practices. So they came together to determine, you know, how which materials were best suited for the method they're about to share and educate others with. Right? Like I'm curious as to that beginning of like you know, you imagine that the people that came out of the school were then their methods on and such and teaching, but it started in this place of this collaboration, right? And yeah, so and that was one of my questions. And the second one was you talked about how particular teachers, some were considered than others, meaning, or just more available than others. Right. And so come in with some guidance, but the students were on their own a lot, sort of figuring it out, right?
Yeah.
So as far as like this, the emphasis on construction and you know all of this accuracy in line and all like I guess I'm like, well, there and anatomy, of course, like it seems like there would need to be more instruction than figure it out. You know, like so I'm just kind of I'm curious as to that.
Okay,
like,
yeah, sure. So basically, you know, part of it has to do with just the fact that like France has been doing this for like a long time, right? And so in a way, like the and again, like the sort of use of materials and that kind of thing occupied like a fairly low rung on the ladder. And so when they hired the first teachers at like the newly formed, you know, Ecole de Beaux-Arts, right? Because again, people were studying in separate studios before, and you know, prior to that, you know, before the revolution, people were still, even when there was like an academy, they were still going just to private studios, like, you know, maybe David or, you know, people like that. The thing is that, like, as far as the materials, I don't think there was a, in a sense, a kind of meeting of the minds between, like, the first three were Jérôme, Isidore Pils, and Cabanel. And the guy who was doing the evening class was Adolphe Yvon. So Adolphe Yvon and Jérôme were both students of Delaroche. And then Cabanel and Pils were both students of, I think they were both students of Picot, who was the same person that trained Bouguereau. But the thing is that when you look at the drawings, they're actually, like, even before there was like the whole school, they're actually like remarkably uniform, right? Because there wasn't really as much of like a multiplicity of methods, and the reason for that, especially at the sort of more elementary stages of drawing, the reason for that is this is kind of like bare essentials of drawing. And so, for instance, if we look at the, you know, Atelier Delaroche, you know, where Jérôme and, you know, Yvon and the guy Armitage that we just talked about, where they studied, you were basically making, you know, this is by Charles Negret, who was one of Jérôme's buddies. You're basically making drawings with a stump with charcoal and black chalk, right? And those have been the materials that pretty much everyone used for a very long time. And the reason for using them was strictly practical, right? So they were using laid paper because laid paper was the only way to make paper for several centuries. Like, they couldn't make, you know, like paper that wasn't textured until relatively recently. Charcoal because they could erase it. They didn't have a way of fixing charcoal, so charcoal was always kind of like a sketching medium that you know, that they would use for stuff like this. But then they would go over it with, you know, natural black chalk, you know, which was like a more permanent thing, you know, for drawing, right? And even when you look at, like, I mean, you know, if you look at like Michelangelo's drawings, those are done with like natural black chalk, right? At a certain point, though, it seems like they started to run out of like the deposits, or like it was like harder to access things like natural black chalk. And so Nicolas Conte developed basically a process through which you could take kind of like less pure or like shittier versions of like graphite or natural black chalk and basically make artificial versions. And that's how we have like the Conte crayons, etc. So the Conte crayon ended up replacing black chalk, even though it is an artificial black chalk, right? Now, you know, the stump and everything, that had been in use since like the 18th century, and it's just the easiest way to get like an even tone on something. So really what we're seeing is the use of like just the simplest sort of best practices, kind of like, you know, in terms of like writing, like everyone has agreed that you just use number 2 pencils, and that's like almost fairly standard worldwide, even without people having to talk about it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
And like, you know, like lined paper and that sort of thing. It's kind of like that, where it's like, well, if you're doing an academic study and you want to do it like at a certain scale, like you want paper that's fairly inexpensive so that students aren't too precious about their drawing. And if you're doing a drawing in full tone, you need a material that can hold quite a bit of like just stuff, right? Like quite a bit of like powder, quite a bit of like, crayon. If you have a really smooth surface, it can sometimes be like harder for the material to stick, right? So you're already working with like textured paper because it does those things and it's relatively easy to erase. So that's number one. If you're going to sketch on top of that, and the nature of an academic drawing, especially one of these week-long academic drawings, is that you're going to be doing a lot of second guessing, right? Because the students are learning, you want to encourage them to correct things that don't make sense without there being a huge cost to them in terms of like, oh no, I put this in wrong, so now I can't ever fix it. You want something like this, right? And charcoal is just like the easiest thing to use for that if you're trying to do like, full value drawings in black. Because red chalk, for instance, was something they used in like the old academy before the revolution, but it was always like notoriously hard to erase, right? So you're trying to find a system that is basically foolproof. Like the system, the technology, as it were, has to be like simple enough that like everyone can use it, right? And so charcoal, after like an initial adjustment period, is just the easiest thing. And they had a very sort of like, if it's not broke, like don't fix it kind of like attitude to this. So there was that. Then black chalk tends to be more permanent. It tends to spread like a little bit more like smoothly, and it is much better than charcoal for producing like the actual darkest tones, but also for getting in like really sharp into like tiny little areas like this. So the two materials were combined, and again, because that became easier to find and probably cheaper and more consistent than natural black chalk, the number 2 Conte crayon just became like the thing that people used. But again, that was like sort of independently of studios. If we look at drawings from the Atelier of Picot, which was a competing studio, which is the one that the other Ecole teachers studied at, the drawings are virtually identical. And part of that's because it'd been like that for like a long time. So like if you go back to the times of David, the aesthetics are different, but the materials are the same, right? And so effectively you get these drawings where, this is a drawing actually by Isidore Pils, who was one of the Ecole professors. Basically if you're trying to get, like a even-ish tone, then, you're just gonna like fill it in, with charcoal or with the crayon, or you're gonna make a little patch and just grab it from there. And I think they ended up just reducing things to like the simplest way, but I don't even think it was conscious. I think it just happened over time. That, in the same way that they have like, it's like we all kind of wash our clothes the same way, or like, we have like certain ways of doing things that are, again, not necessarily agreed upon, but they're just like, there wouldn't be an easier way to do it. I think that's basically what happened with this. Like even the baguette bread that they would use to erase stuff, that didn't get replaced till like the 20th century when they finally like got rubber that was like good enough to to like make into little points and stuff. But as far as that goes, there weren't really that many sort of like changes or innovations. The one thing that happened is this is one thing. They did figure out how to apply like fixative to charcoal. And actually, funny enough, the person who popularized having finished drawings in charcoal, like all the way from beginning to end in charcoal, was actually Adolphe Yvon. And again, Adolphe Yvon was the person who was teaching the evening class. So the reason for that is initially at the, before the reforms of 1863, and I imagine this is going to sound fairly silly, when the students would sign up and compete for that evening class, they would get a new teacher every month. Like every month, someone from the actual academy had to, as part of like their duties as an academician, they had to come and teach. They had to like volunteer. And so a lot of them hated it, by the way. And so basically, the students would choose to like not come sometimes if there was like a teacher that they didn't like or whatever. Eventually they thought that was a bad idea, so they just gave the class to one guy, and that was Adolphe Yvon. These are the drawings that Adolphe Yvon did that were some of like the very first charcoal drawings that were exhibited that were, again, just charcoal drawings. So these are some of the ones that helped to popularize that. But again, his actual like methods themselves like didn't really differ a whole lot from like what everybody else was doing. In painting, there was a little bit more difference, but not that much. Like even when you look at the student work, it was like fairly uniform. But anyway, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, there were just certain things that they kind of arrived at, like even like the pose lengths and stuff like that, or like the size of the drawings, that I don't think they even thought about it. They were so used to it, and it worked well enough that they were like, oh, this is just like, and some of them are just random things that are just kind of like depending on what's available. Like they always use like an imperial size sheet for academic drawings, which is our standard 18 by 24 sheet. But I think that was just a convenient size that paper makers made. And then they just were like, all right, we'll use this. So they just kind of used whatever was like on hand. For instance, like vine charcoal never seemed to really catch on in France. They used willow charcoal because willow is what they had. I think vine charcoal is more like an American thing, as from what I've seen. But anyway, yeah. So again, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to jump in. But I figured here, we can pick it back up with our, for the time being, we can pick it back up with our buddy Julian Alden Weir.
Just real quick, I think part of Jennifer's question that she mentioned at the end was like some of the other components of teaching. Right. Beyond materials like anatomy and so forth, like how did they essentially check all those boxes while still leaving that breadth of time between the professor coming in?
Yeah, so basically what would happen is like when a teacher did critiques, you would follow them along and listen to everyone's critiques, right? So not just the ones for you. So, effectively you'd have like just a whole gang of students following, someone like Jerome from student to student, right? Like for instance here, and you would get the benefit of, the critiques that everyone got. You also had like older students that would kind of, help you along with stuff. Now, the critiques were substantially about, movement, about construction, about anatomy, about values, about measuring. It was basically about like anything that could come up, but it was in a very like kind of a practical way, right? So, for example, we actually have examples of what those critiques would look like. And here are some from Jerome. And the thing is that, again, because the material stuff was so simple, you wouldn't really spend a whole lot of time like thinking about that. So the rest of your time was occupied in terms of like almost like the content, right? Like what you are writing about rather than how to make the letters. So, for example, and all the teaching boiled down to the ensemble, like the overall thing, and comparing everything to everything else. Anatomy was taught in a way that was kind of like very practical, but I'll show you some stuff along with that in a second. So let's see. In front of me squatted a little fellow in a faded coat. Blavet curled near my feet on a color box. Directly, Jerome had dropped easily into this unpretending posture. And he said, observe. He said, looking earnestly up. Blavet had begun a very neat drawing. Your muscles are inlaid against one another. They are carpentered. There's something that is not the vivacity of flesh. Go next Sunday to the Louvre and observe some of the drawings of Raphael. He does not use so much work as you, yet one feels the elasticity of his flesh, packed together of contractile fibers based upon bone and sheathed in satin. You tell me you will express that texture afterward. I tell you, Raphael expressed it from the first stroke. So for instance there, some of these terms are not terms that we use very often anymore, but when he says that the muscles are inlaid against one another, inlaid is a term used for mosaics and tiles, right? So basically what he's telling him is that the muscles are just sitting side by side, but they're not like, overlapping. They're not like wrapping around each other or anything like that. Does that make sense? And so when we talk about construction, he's talking about things like that, where like he wants the students to feel the elasticity of the flesh, right? And there's another version of this where he talks about like, the muscles like dragging, or like one thing dragging onto like another thing. So he's talking about like the continuity, right, from one muscle to the next one, through like an entire limb. He's also talking about like, again, like feeling those like contractile fibers, basically like not having a drawing that is necessarily like super neat and superficial, but feeling how, things are like wrapping around, or how, the body is like growing, let's say. And then he has him go look at Raphael. Again, the student said that, I'll just show that texture afterwards, but, Jerome wanted it expressed like from the very beginning, because it's not necessarily something, that kind of continuity, you don't achieve it by more work, you achieve it by thinking about it. It's more like an intellectual kind of a process. So, for example, if we look at a Raphael drawing like this, it doesn't have, as much labor in it as, your standard Ecole de Beaux-Arts drawing. But since he's thinking about, how, the elasticity of the flesh here makes it so that you can't move your arm without also pulling on your back, right? So like every movement, from here, in order for this to happen, it has to be pulling on every part, going back, going back, going back, going back, which is something that, the students wouldn't always get, right? For instance, Julian Alden Weir, whose work we were just looking at, if we look at one of his paintings from the time that he was studying with Jerome, like this one here, he's doing that thing where the muscles and the bones, the structures in general, feel separate. There isn't really that feeling that there is elastic flesh going over this, that this is all part of a continuous whole, right? There's a kind of separateness, a kind of hacked out of wood sort of quality to these forms that you don't necessarily see in somebody like Jerome himself, right? If you look at one of Jerome's drawings, even like, the simplest things that he would do, even when he's doing, potentially less work than his students, every one of like these little, tiny strokes is following along with like the rhythm of this leg, right? Every one of these is like, pulling across, that rib cage over the muscles of the spine. And so there would be these like seeds planted like this, and then the student had to like basically, sit with that and figure it out like during the course of the week. There's a few, there's other examples of this. That's actually the funny thing about this, is that this is seen as this kind of mystery, but if anything, there's too much stuff about this. There's sort of like too much to even cover in the span of 3 hours, or, any sort of, large allotment of time. Here, for instance, he said, your color rages, and that of the model is lambent. Besides, your figure is tumbling, it is not on its legs. I will save you labor by telling you the simplest way of correcting this. Turn the canvas upside down and draw it over. The error is radical. So he can be pretty scathing when he wanted to be. But let's say, like, to another one, he said, you do not yet understand the continuity of forms in nature. You accent too highly. That is vulgarity. For instance, it appears to you that the internal and external vastus, the quads, when gathered in at the knee, cause a break in the outline, like the cap of a pillar. Similarly, under the calf. You are deceived, and you should use your eyes. The accent is not in the line, aka the outline, it is in the shading beside the line, and even there, far more slightly than you think. Here again, the vein crosses the forearm, you make a hideous saliency. Nature never, absolutely never, breaks a line. And here's the student's sort of like reaction to this. He says, I was listening intently to these dicta, which were, at all events, the compressed results of a life of study, drinking in all I could hear and oblivious of the course of things. Anyway, so for instance, what he's talking about there, that, ignorance of the continuity of forms and, whenever there's sort of like, a form popping out, making it pop out too much, that is exactly what Kenyon Cox is doing here, right? Because he's not used to looking for the continuity of these forms, every form, every bit of contrast he makes stand out too much, right? And that's something that he was probably dinged for in class, right? This here, everything is considered separately. The muscles, the structures are not playing as a team, as an ensemble, right? It's sort of every element, everything for itself in this moment. Now, you can see that in his early drawings, right? He's considering every one of these single things as something separate, which ironically also creates a lot of work, right? If you look at something and you think, let's say, let's say you look at, let's say you're building something, like a wall, and instead of looking at it as one wall, you think of it as 20 bricks, right? That you're like, oh, I have to like apply mortar to each one and set it in place and whatever. When you frame it like that, it seems like a lot of stuff to do. But when you think of it as just one wall, then it becomes a little bit easier to like conceptualize, right? And to, to engage in that labor. So they were always directing students to look at the overall thing. This drawing over here, this person maybe couldn't see as much, as Kenyon Cox could in all these structures, but it did help them to see this greater continuity. So what Jerome was talking about the accent being in the shading beside the line rather than in the line, he's talking about this, where this cuts in, when you see the roundness of this quad here, it's not really a break in the outline. The outline is pretty continuous. The overlap of those forms is being shown primarily inside, right? The change happens on the inside, right? Jerome, philosopher, empath. But that's like, a lot of it really is about doing less work. Like if you look at, this drawing, which is from yet another studio, the studio of Léon Bonnat, and done by, Bonnat was a student of some other guy, Léon Cognier. It's all the same, right? Like you'll notice that the student here is popping out each of these forms a whole bunch. And yeah, there is an indication of the large overall movement of the leg, but it is getting watered down by all these little bumps. And so that same student, in a pose that is basically mirrored, right, later on, is able to, get some of that same movement, but without having to, zigzag so much on the outlines, and while being able to keep these a lot more unified. So it's primarily things like that they were addressing. In fact, there's a really, really great little tidbit in here from Julian Alden Weir, because again, he's reporting back to his brother about like pretty much everything. In fact, his brother gave him a budget so that the Yale Art School in 1879 was full of academic nudes from Julian Alden Weir and his classmates, because his brother gave him money to buy just good examples of academic paintings. Here's Julian's academic painting that we just saw in the back here. Here's a bunch of other ones. So in any case, let me see if we can find that quote real quick here. Here we go. This is the one. So he's telling his brother, this is in 1875. Also, it is really funny to see someone call their brother bro, like 150 years ago. People don't really change that much, But anyway, he says, when I first went to Jerome, all that I looked for was trying to produce a good effect of color, and as we in our ignorance say, use the model. But by degrees, Jerome led me on until I found out that there was a human being before me, which I was to represent as well as possible. Look at that. Jerome, philosopher, yet again, helps Julian Alden Weir discover that models are people. Now, old fellow, old fellow always gets me. That's such a funny thing to call somebody. Now, old fellow, in the copying of a locomotive, it does not suffice to copy the outside forms. The thing won't go. All the machinery must be studied, the forms, the joints, and screws. One must know where to put the bowels of the machine. Then, after all this is done, a person can know where to put the red, white, and blue stripes. That part's lost on me. I guess they decorated trains with red, white, and blue stripes at the time. Anyway, he says, so it is with art. You must know where every bone is and the attachments of muscles, and for this reason, Jerome says, schools are necessary. In school, he says, there's your model. Represent it as close as possible, and before you touch your canvas, know what you are going to do. In this way, one will make intellectual progress. And when one returns to his own room, like your own studio, let him use what he has learned and do as he thinks. So you see, John, one cannot lose his originality unless one is a very weak mortal, and then it would be the best thing for him. So anyway, there's an interesting bit in here, by the way, because this kind of training sowed the seeds of its own demise in some ways. He says, originality means mannerism. Delacroix and Delaroche have both said, at the end of their careers, that the greatest painters are those who paint with naivete. So, there was also the reference to like Mother Goose's remedies and all that. The thing is, you have to look at this in context where, 19th century art of the kind that we're looking at is a response to, French society at this time is a response to the, monarchy that they just overthrew, right? And so the excesses of Rococo painting, right? The sort of forms popping out all over the place and the formulas they had where they basically painted flesh pretty much the same way, like one time after another. I think it was Francois Boucher himself, actually, that when an English artist came to visit him, he was like, oh yeah, I used to use models when I was a student, but I don't do that anymore. I just draw everything out of my head. But the thing is that like you can tell, you know what I mean? Now, of course, that's probably an exaggeration, but like one does not simply paint, a person who looks like this, when consulting a model. And so the thing is that everything here is made up, right? Or at least substantially it's made up. And so you have that, which to French people at this time, after they had, like a century of this, they, it's like wanting to eat something savory after having like just dessert, for, an entire meal. And so when you look at the work that people were doing in these studios at the Beaux-Arts, they are these insanely pragmatic, very sort of like empirical kind of things, right? Where it's like almost sort of like a scientific kind of fascination with the individual model, right? And again, that is a reaction to, the way that things worked before. Now, also back then they had all kinds of recipes. It was like, oh, you use like always Naples yellow for the forehead and always like, cool blue in the halftones and whatever. They didn't have that in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was like, okay, how about we teach you how to analyze color and you just look at it and you just do it? And that had its own issues, right? But because it's not like people always look that different. You can see patterns emerging. But, that naivete that they're talking about doesn't mean sort of doing things without discipline. It just means not letting purely preconceived notions lead the way. But again, it's sort of like, that's the way that like a lot of science works, right? Where it's like you might have, a theory about something, but usually that theory comes from, like you almost have to earn it through practice, where you observe something, you formulate an idea about it, you test that idea, and then once you test that idea, you can decide whether, you have to alter your theory or not, right? So in any case, because they had almost like a background of, almost like background noise or like this cultural memory of all of these like formulas and recipes and little like tricks and things, they had a disdain for, like little tricks and all that. And so even when painting, actually if we go back to Julian Alden Weir here, you start to get like a fairly standard narrative about this. Let's see, so yeah, so after he says the thing about Mother Goose's remedy, he says, blah, blah, blah. In other words, to represent what he sees honestly with solid painting, right? So not having like a bunch of like mediums and special McGilp and cooking lead at home and, you know, basically making meth to paint with, you know, but rather like just straight paint, right? He says, the students who paint the whole figure generally spend 2 days in drawing it in. As regards to a student leaving, he ought never to leave until he has arrived at a state where his work does not improve. There are men in Gérôme's who have been there for 13 years, but this might be said to be too long. The models they have are selected by the students from those who show themselves every Monday, mostly men, and rarely children, as they can't pose well. Big shock. Generally, once a month we have a female. In the drawing, they use the stump, shading just enough to express the darks and half tints, and always they make them take in the whole of the paper, the head within a 1/4 inch of the top, and the same with the bottom if standing. They find where the middle would come, like the middle of the paper, and then how many heads high the model is, looking for the grand lines. Perspective, anatomy, history of art are each twice a week, but the most necessary and the greatest advantage of the Ecole is that we have the life model 4 hours a day to paint from, that's in the mornings, and then in Yvonne's school, which is really just a class, but they call it a school. Yvonne's school, the 70 best have from 4 till 6 every afternoon. So, you know, he's telling them how to run the school, you know, to get someone to leave some money so they could, you know, do that. Blah, 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 blah. So if you can get someone to leave some money or endow a chair for a model 4 hours each day, it would advance your school more rapidly than in any other way. For there, you can study color and drawing, not as Rembrandt, Rubens, nor Gérôme, but as nature inspires them. So the thing about these teachers is that none of them were trying to create imitators. Gérôme was not interested in creating little Gérômes. Cabanel was not interested in creating little Cabanels, and neither was Peels. And actually that speaks to Jennifer's question in that the reason why I think this was fairly standard is because they taught the most vanilla thing. Like they weren't really teaching you how they, like their special things that they used for their pictures. It was more like, this is the ABC, like, you know, this is like the bare sort of standard, most like vanilla uniform way of doing things. So it wasn't really seen as like a kind of like, oh, this is so-and-so's method or whatever. It was just kind of like, this is how you do this. So again, not as Rembrandt or Rubens or Gérôme, but as nature inspires them. In Gérôme's atelier, he comes around twice a week, Wednesdays and Saturdays. I'd heard Tuesdays, but maybe he changed that at some point. In Cabanel's, he comes but once a week, and in Peel's, he only visits his atelier occasionally. That might be nonsense. I've read a biography of Peel's that says that he was there all the time and he was doing demos, which is not really something that the other two did in the same way. But, you know, every student, when they write about their teacher, has a much more favorable set of things to say. So anyway, it says, Peel's, they say, is the strongest in color, Cabanel next, and Gérôme the last. Gérôme is very severe with the drawing and in representing the model as near as possible, which I think is the school for a student. So AKA, like, not idealizing. He is liberal and says nothing as to the manner. What he wants is to have the students study serious, which I must confess I have not yet learned, comparatively speaking. What they mean by serious is they don't want you to be doing any kind of fancy stuff, like trying to get any crazy brushstrokes in there. What they want you is to try to match what the model looks like and to capture the model, and that's effectively like the extent of your job, right? Like the job is not to show off. That was probably the thing they liked the least, or like adding like a fanciful background or something. So anyway, in using the stump, he will not let the beginner put in anything but the principal darks, and not until he has advanced will he let them put in the demi-tint, aka the halftone. With regard to the new student in color, give him no theories. He has nature before him. Let him represent it. After he draws the model in with charcoal, he sets it by pouring milk on, and then when dry, rubs over it a general tone of the flesh and the background in the right value with it. They have draperies of different tones to change occasionally. Make the student paint the background as it is and not a la mode, right? So again, not adding like any kind of fancy like, foliage or putting the model in like some kind of background in a cave or in space or, whatever else. Again, these are all things that people used to do in the 18th century, right? So they're saying to not do that. Anyway, let's see. In Jerome's, there are about 70 students. The model's on a raised platform or throne. Light comes from a large window, etc. So you see the painting or drawing from life are both in the same room. If there are not enough stools or places in front, the draftsman takes an easel, but not unless. Easels are not for drawing in this in this school. Easels are for painting. That always made me think of if anyone's ever watched Glengarry Glen Ross, where there's like the Alec Baldwin speech about coffee is for closers. It's kind of like that. Like easels are for painters. The folks doing drawing usually do not get one. But I think actually the clearest illustration of all that stuff is Julian Aldenweir's roommate, Albert Edelfelt. So some of you have probably seen this before, right? His studies that he did at Jerome's have been making the rounds quite a bit for the last couple of years. And so he was a student, he was from a Swedish-speaking family in Finland, which is part of Russia at the time, I believe. Or had just gained its independence. And anyway, so he went through a whole course of study in Belgium, but when he came to Jerome's studio, Jerome kind of made him start over. Not from the antique, but part of what you find is that, if we were to look at one of Edelfelt's studies, maybe we'll pull one up later, one of his studies from when he was in Antwerp, everything's like a little soft and mushy and everything's like kind of round. One of the big things as far as French training in this period was searching for the character, right? So for instance, like if this person has square shoulders, making the shoulders square. If they have like a really pointy nose, making it pointy. If the forehead is round, making it round, right? Not just drawing or painting a generic person, but specifically this person, right? And getting also the color is part of it, right? The color of this person. It's almost like a love letter to the model, right? So anyway, this is, again, one of Albert Edelfelt's studies that he did in class, again, in the span of a week from Monday through Saturday. But then this is the kind of stuff that they would do at home. So effectively, it was something like Jerome would come and give you some advice, like say, hey, this does not look continuous enough. This looks like the muscles are next to each other, not wrapping around each other. And, you maybe would go to the anatomy lecture, right, and take some notes and all that. This is what one of the professors, who was a doctor, this is what one of the anatomy classes looked like. So they would bring out a live model a lot of the time. They'd have bones. They would have écorchés in the room. They would show you like, okay, when the model does this, then this is what happens. People would be sitting here like taking notes and, doing little drawings and stuff. But a lot of it was like you got the information and then you had to, take some initiative, right? So Edelfelt, like on his own time, was doing, like he was like studying the anatomy, right? And I think the way that a lot of that works very well is, let's say you, rather than just copying stuff out of books all the time, let's say you see something in the model where you're like, I don't know what that is. So then during the week, you go and find out. You pull out a book, you have your study, you look at it, and you're like, okay, well, this could only be so many things. So, like let's say this bump right here, what could that be? Well, then you crack open your anatomy book and you're like, well, okay, that's clearly the deltoid. The clavicle doesn't extend all the way out to the very edge of the shoulder. And this looks pretty squarish. Oh, I must be looking at the acromion process, right? And by learning things that way, it does tend to stick a little bit better. But here's the thing, people were also getting composition homework. They were also doing just like, fanciful little noodle people and that sort of thing. And when you had a composition assignment, those weren't judged on, how well drawn something was or on anatomy or anything like that. That was just judged on how well you told the story. That was it, right? So anyway, you get stuff like that. And then caricatures. People would make caricatures of each other all the time. It was part of like how they would tease each other. It was part of how they would pass the time. So here's a later one by Edelfelt of Anders Zorn. And if you're wondering how we know that it's Zorn, it says Zorn on the side. And frankly, that looks just like him, right? And here's another one that Edelfelt did of Zorn. So basically, they made a bunch of cartoons of each other, and this is how they got good at the character. So they were in class for a certain amount of time, but here's the thing about French training. It's a whole ecosystem, right? So yeah, you have some, painter that comes and like, kind of supervises you, but you are on your own basically going to the Louvre. They'll say like, oh, you know what, go look at Raphael. So you go and look at Raphael. Or you know what, go crack open an anatomy book. So you go and do that. Or like, hey, you're having trouble with this. The teacher's more like a doctor, where they're like, all right, take this for 10 days and see if you feel better, right? And so you still have to go and do the thing. So, for instance, let's see. This is a quote from the painter Ingres, right? Who's known for idealizing, but that's what he did like in his own work. When he was talking to his students, he would say stuff like this. He says, of a strong man, do not make a semi-resemblance, a semi-likeness. Search well the Herculean character. Then he goes on to say, in everyone, there is a caricature that it is necessary to seek out. Search for the physiognomy of the model. If they are, large or small, if they're feeble or strong. The painter should give the physiognomy. Search for the caricature, right? This is a very serious academic painter, right? But this is what they did, right? And so, doing these little characters is what would teach you how to get a likeness. Going to the anatomy sessions and stuff like that would teach you more about the anatomy. Doing the composition homework would teach you about composition. And you would, be going to the museums and stuff and constantly sort of like, you were given almost like the tools to look at stuff with, and then you had to go out in there and look at stuff. It's like someone hands you like a magnifying glass, and then you have to go and put the clues together. Here's J.C. Leyendecker. He went to the Académie Julian, which was a for-pay school, but to get all the benefits of the Ecole, you had to learn French. That was part of like the exam that you had to take. And so if you wanted to just pay some money at Julian's and not have to take the whole big exam and do all that, then that's what you would do. At this time, the system was very good in a lot of ways, but it definitely had some major problems, the largest of which was it was only open to men, right? And so could women get an education at this time? Yes, but unfortunately, they had to pay for it, right? It wasn't the free government school was not open to women until 1897, and even then it was only one studio, right? And some people had to do it sort of kicking and screaming. But if you wanted to get an education, you could go to Julian's. Now, Julian's was not some kind of enlightened beacon either. Julian basically realized that women had, there were other places they could go. There were other paying academies. But he was like, well, I could probably charge them 2.5 times what I charge men. So that's what he did. Which is crazy because this is like, you want to talk about like a sort of, just the worst kind of like, Scrooge McDuck kind of person that you can imagine. In some ways, this guy was it. He did a lot to promote people's careers, but he was also, maybe not the greatest guy. Because, basically, he charged men less because men could go to the free school, so he had an incentive to keep the prices low for them. Because women had fewer options, he could charge them more. But the deal is that this guy just rented the studios and hired the models. The teachers volunteered their time for free. Right? So he's just like he's literally just printing money, right? But anyway, so otherwise the instruction was pretty much the same. People like Bouguereau, Lefebvre, Tony Robert Fleury, who his students called basically Handsome Tony. All of them were donating their time and were dispensing the same instruction to, both their male and female students. They didn't really make any distinction there. But Leyendecker has some thoughts about this that are, pretty helpful in terms of the teaching style. He says, "Thoroughness is the principle upon which the French art schools have won their success. It doesn't take long to discover that style and dash will not make a drawing or painting go here as it will an illustration back home. Serious work," there's that word again, "getting right down to the foundation principles is the demand which is laid upon every student over here. If I learned anything, it was that a picture is really only valuable for the thought behind it. There is little talk of handling, aka like technique, aka like paint application, and the catch tricks of the trade, and much emphasis upon a deep and serious significance in everything attempted." So you'd say 3 models pose at the same time in each room, and the new pupil takes his materials and begins work upon the subject which attracts him. But sometime in the first week, the professor comes around and takes a look at the beginner's study. That is an important moment, for if the teacher does not approve of it, the nouveau is assigned to work from cast instead of from life. So there, if you arrive on the day when the teacher's not there, you can start right from the model, but the teacher reserves the right to send you right back to the casts. He says the mornings are devoted to class study from models and casts, and the afternoons to composition work. The subject of the composition is announced in class and is briefly explained by the teacher. Students are not allowed to consult with any authorities bearing upon the subject, but must make their composition wholly from the meager data given to them by the professor. The pupil is at liberty to do his composition in his own atelier or combination lodging room and studio. Saturday afternoon is looked forward to as the great occasion of the week. Then the compositions are brought to the classroom and the teacher passes from one easel to another, giving his criticisms to the pupils, who crowd around him, clambering upon chairs and stools to secure points of vantage from which to view the pictures. And even Corrales Duran, Sargent's teacher, actually did that. He actually has a lot to say about like picture making and how to pick like the sort of seminal moment in a work of literature, to design your composition and that kind of thing. But anyway, I think this is probably a good spot to take a break. So how are we doing so far? All this stuff making sense?
Yes, we have a question that just popped into chat.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah's asking, are there any women artists from this school that are documented? I think she's referring to Julian.
Oh yeah, no, plenty actually. So let me see. I can pull some up from the vault when we come back from break. But probably one of the more famous people that went to school there was Marie Bashkirtseff. Are they on par with the masters discussed? Oh yeah, yes. So one of the funny things about it is that, of course, people would use all the same tired, stupid arguments like, they didn't think that women would be able to paint as well as men and blah, 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 blah. But since they were getting the same instruction at Julian's as the men were getting, Julian's had a bunch of like franchises almost, right? Like they had like different studios in different parts of town. And it used to have mixed classes where men and women were in the same like classrooms, but the city cracked down on that. So, women could study from nude models, but they had to be in like their own separate studios. So there were studios for women and there were studios for men. But the school would have these competitions that were school-wide, right? And, women did end up doing a lot of portraits. Now, they could study from the nude model, but I think maybe it wasn't as often, or for whatever reason, women would get more practice in painting portraits. And so they just would absolutely destroy the men in the portrait painting competitions, basically to the point where the men started complaining about it. So yeah, I mean, imagine that. Like if you give people the resources and the same tools, they get really good at it. Huge shock, right? So yes, women were doing, just fine when they were given the same tools as men, as would be expected. But Marie Bashkirtseff was incredible. She became really famous because she was basically I forget if she was, I think she was Ukrainian, but she was like Russian or Ukrainian, and she came from like a noble family, So she would roll up to Julian's with a servant and like a tiny little dog, and the servant would be like giving her bonbons and all this, like, you know, all this stuff. She'd show up in these like fancy gowns. And most of the other people there were middle class, but they weren't like rich, right? And, you know, they were there at great personal sacrifice often to be at the school. And so, you know, she's her diaries basically start from the time that she's like 15, right? And go through the end of her life. And she died very, very young. And it's like, you know, this big tragic thing. And so her diaries were published after she passed away. You can find them online. They're completely free. Basically, when she arrived, she just imagined, like manifested a rivalry into being with this girl who was not even aware of her existence. There's another girl there who was just trying to do her job, trying to learn how to paint so she could like make money, you know, and like have a career because she wasn't rich. And rich girl rolls up and it's just like, we are mortal enemies. And the other girl like doesn't even know who she is. So anyway, she knew who she was after a while. She made very, you know, she was a teacher's pet. She would like suck up to Julian. Of course, like Julian, because she was rich, she was, you know, more than happy to indulge. She also like, I don't know, was like very familiar with like the teachers, where like she imagined a whole love affair that never happened with Tony Robert Fleury, who was one of the teachers. He was, at Julian's you'd have 2 teachers and they would switch off every month. So in the studio that she was at, I believe she had Bouguereau and she had Tony Robert Fleury, who the students in the women's studios called Handsome Fleury. I prefer Beautiful Tony, personally, but, you know, basically there was like, you know, this whole thing where like, you know, obviously she wouldn't call him this in person, but in the diary she's like, Tony told me my study was beautiful and that I'm making really good progress and then blah, 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 blah. And like, I think you winked at me and like stuff like that, right? So, in any case, it's phenomenal reading. But her progress was tremendous. I will, you know, I mean, it is true.
How do you spell her last name, Ramon?
What's that?
How do you spell her last name?
Here, let's go ahead and pull it up because it's kind of a long one. Also, you know, in the women's studios, they wouldn't have the same pranks that the men would have. But they would draw the most savage caricatures of each other. So it's like this, Marie Bashkirtsev. And she was actually commissioned by Julian to paint a picture of one of the women's studios. So that's what this is. So here they are. There's like a little kid posing, and you know, here's like a bunch of the other students. Apparently, she was a tyrant, like because this was painted in the studio, and she would like yell at other like at the other like women in there to like not move because she was painting them. And Julian wanted this because it was a big advertisement for his school, right? So like, of course he wanted this. This is her. This is a self-portrait that she did. She became really good friends with Jules Bastien Lepage until the time of his death. Here is a painting that she made that you can find on Google Arts and Culture, which is a phenomenal website. You can, you know, really get like fairly high-res, you know, images of these. I've seen this one in person. Beautiful painting. You know, I mean, seriously, like, she wasn't kidding. I mean, she really was like. Was she egotistical and like, you know, kind of nuts? Like, yes. But, you know, was she also really good? Yes. There's actually like, you can actually find the critiques that Tony Robert Fleury gave her on this specific painting in her diary. And you can find out how long it took for her to paint this. And, you know, there's just like the amount of stuff that you can find about, you know, this time period is actually kind of wild. Again, way more than people think there usually is. Let's see if we can caricature. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so this is a caricature that someone else made of her and Julian. You know, like. Dancing.
Oh, he's like blushing.
Yeah. And then here's a caricature of the other girl who was her rival. Now, this girl didn't look like this. Like, this is just like, they're just being mean. Like, I forget.
I like her bowls.
Yeah, I forget what her name was. I'll have to was it Catherine something. After the break, I'll pull up some of her work. But like, this is it. Again, people back then were just people, you know what I mean? So like all the good, all the bad, you know, all like the pettiness and whatever, like that was all there. This was, oh yeah, this was also one of Marie Bashkirtsev. Oh yeah, Louise Breslau. Louise Breslau.
So both those caricatures, the last two were of her?
Yeah, with those.
Yeah, so this one is of Marie Bashkirtsev, I think, and so is this one, and this one is of Louise Breslau. Louise Breslau, she has a self-portrait somewhere around here. Oh, she's also by like a phenomenal painter. I mean, like, and okay, listen, like, was Julian kind of a dickhead? Yes, but once the students were in his school, I mean, again, this is not, you know, altruism. This is, you know, also it was good for his school. But he would do a lot for his students to like promote them at the salon, and he had a lot of influence after a while. So, you know, he would make sure that his students got good spots. He would basically lobby for them to get like, you know, for, you know, jurors to vote for them, etc. You know, and so it did benefit the students' careers. If I'm not mistaken, this is a self-portrait by Louise Breslau. So she didn't look like that. She looked like this. But anyway, you know, you leave a bunch of 20-year-olds unsupervised in a studio in a highly competitive pressure cooker environment, and you know, this is what they're gonna do. They're gonna roast each other either with iron hot pokers or with scathing caricatures. You know, that's just, I don't make the rules. This is just what people do, apparently. But anyway, let's go ahead and take a little break, and then we'll come back. And I mean, there's plenty more to say, but you know, I won't keep you too long. So we'll wrap up a little bit. Sound good?
Before we wrap up, though, I do want you to potentially share your painting with us. That's been part of the Prix de Rome process. I've been excited to see the progression. So
yeah, sure. Well, when we come back, what we can do is I can give you all like a little. I realize it's been a lot of art history, a lot of chatter. I can show you some practical stuff, and we can talk about the Prix de Rome a little bit.
Cool.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take 5, and then we'll come back. All right, come back in.
Napoleon before the state.
And we are being joined by a guest right now. Sorry, 1 second. Got to just adjust. We got a Meatball here.
Yep. Ready to set up.
Oh yeah. Read and chat.
Yeah, I think we got something in the chat. Let me just adjust this here. Yeah, there we go. Let's see. What do we got here?
Oh yeah.
Let's see. Oh, it's just a hello Dojo fan. Thank you so much. You putting this together? Oh, you are very welcome, Reed. Yeah, I'm glad this is helpful. But yeah. So let me know if you all have any questions right now. If not, we'll just you know, power along the last couple minutes. You know, we can talk about the Prix de Rome and all that. All right, so here, let's go ahead and hop back. Oh man, I mean, I never really gets old. But anyway, going back to this stuff. There's a few things that I think are very much like worth like mentioning and keeping in mind. So, for instance, like the Bard course, right? I'm sure, like, you know, people are familiar with this, right? This is like one of the plates, you know, from the Bard course. And there's a certain like neatness to this, right? Like when you look at this, it's like these like, you know, perfectly clean, clear lines, and you know, people look at this and they see those like, you know, those subtle halftones and they think, oh, graphite. This is something that we do in graphite. And we should, you know, follow exactly what this is and have a perfect outline before we start shading and whatever. That is not how that works. First of all, this is a lithograph. This is not a drawing. And so what happened is, the prints that students were drawing from, the examples they were drawing from, were basically done with like a lot of hatching. So they were really elaborate, and the authorities in France were mad that they thought the quality of the drawing was very poor because the students were spending all their time worrying about hatching rather than worrying about like actual drawing, right? They were too concerned with like the superficial material aspects of those prints. And so they wanted something that was like more sort of scientific in a sense, something more like almost like objective, right? And in some ways kind of more vanilla, right? Something that doesn't have so much handwriting but has more content, more substance. So what happened is Gérôme was supervising this effort, right? And Goupil was spearheading this. Goupil was a guy who had a publishing house, and I believe he was also an art dealer. He was basically someone who wanted to make a lot of money from like this big government contract thing, right? Because, basically the government would maybe buy a bunch of those prints for a bunch of like regional schools and that sort of thing. So anyway, what they did is they had Gérôme hand over a bunch of drawings, cast drawings done by his students, like hand-picked drawings. And then what Bargue had to do was Bargue had to, lithograph them onto a stone, so he had to redraw them, and then he had to basically reverse engineer them, right? So of course, in hindsight, it is very easy to make like, oh yeah, it was only one line for this and one line for that and one thing for this. This is not actually documenting the process of this drawing, right? You are seeing a kind of theoretical thing that he was like, well, this is how I would start it. And again, it's in hindsight, right? And it's with a lithographic crayon. It's a much more sort of like indelible sort of tool than, like charcoal. So anyway, the person who drew this original drawing that Bargue based this plate on was this guy, Le Comte du Nuit. This is what his actual work looked like once he left the studio, right? So you see, here's a head. Here's like a head with like a center line down down the middle and like a little axis line here. This is like a head from imagination. Here's a head of Homer that he probably did from some kind of statue, right? Notice that no one draws like this once they leave school. This is not a way of drawing. This is a way of learning, right? But once the training wheels are off, you draw however the hell you like, right? That's the whole point. This is supposed to be liberating. And so you might look at this and be like, oh yeah, well that's just like some little sketch that he did. If he was doing something serious, he would draw it like this. No, he wouldn't. This is a study for a major painting. And the thing is that like what you see in terms of like rigidity and discipline in academic drawings is literally something that people only did when they were in school. Now, this is a manual published by Adolphe Yvon, who was, again, the common teacher that people had in the evenings if they tested into his class. Testing into his class was a huge ordeal. Here's Sargent's take on it. He's talking to his friend Ben. He says, "My dear Ben, I'm in the midst of my exam and very busy. Consequently, I can only write a few lines to thank you for your kind and interesting letter. The exam is the concours de place, so the contest for spots or for places, for the life school of Monsieur Yvon, and it seems unreasonably long, difficult, and terrible. It began on the 26th of September, and 2 weeks are still to come. The épreuves, which means like tests, of perspective and anatomy are over. I wish I might say as much for the dessin d'ornement, which means like ornament drawing, which is in store for us tomorrow morning. Ornament drawing is like they just give you like a piece of a column, or like just some little pediment thing, and then you draw that. I believe you had 6 hours for that. He says, but the supreme moment is one of 12 hours wherein we must make a finished drawing of, is one of 12 hours wherein we must make a finished drawing of the human form divine. 12 hours, right? That's the amount of time they got to do a finished drawing. Now again, if you're in the morning classes, you're in there with the painters. And so you get 4 hours for 6 days, so you get 24 hours of drawing time. Why? Is it because a drawing takes 24 hours? No, it's because they have to accommodate the painters too. So the people drawing get more time than they need, and the people painting get a little bit less time than they need, right? But whenever they had classes that were just drawing, they're like, you're not getting 24 hours, you get 12. That's it, right? So anyway, this was to get into the class. During the class, all you would do is 12-hour drawings. So anyway, the person teaching it for 19 years was Adolphe Yvon. There's a book that he published. Here he is, this is the book. So, some of the stuff is pretty standard, but there are things that, whenever you look at people like, thinking about cylinders and stuff like that, or like, let's say the way that people approach the Bargue plates today, they're mostly talking about like comparing angles and filling in shapes and all this optical stuff. That is not how that was thought of back then. Sure, you have a plumb line, sure, you compare angles and stuff, but, you are thinking in 3D. You're thinking of the implications of those angles. They're not just there just to be there, right? So anyway, this is a sort of, abbreviated three large steps kind of thing to this. There's the mise en place, which means like the setting in place. The French use this term for like, even for cooking too, like, when you're like plating a dish, I think it's like literally the same thing. So it's just setup, right? So you have like your plumb line, you got your heads counted out, you got some like major angles, basically guidelines. It's like barely even drawing. Here, notice like it's, before you do all this fancy outline stuff, it's just from the hip, boom, to the ankle. Just a straight line, unencumbered, uncomplicated, right? Here, just boom, boom, right? Then he has a step where it's, they call it le trait. Trait is like a stroke, like a pencil stroke. And effectively, it's just like, a step where like they're kind of finalizing the outline. This is more like a sketch, basically. So again, is the stuff actually finalized? No. This is a lithograph, right? So you don't see any of the actual sketchiness that would be in like a real drawing. Also, this guy lost his hair from one to the next one, God knows why. But he gets it again at the end. And this is like, the stage where, there's like the modeling, right? Of course, you're going to see a bunch of hatching here because you can't smudge on a lithographic stone, right? So these are limitations of like the printing material at the time. Now, funny enough, Adolphe Yvon was a busy man. He was not really about to like make separate drawings for this, I guess, right? And so it looks like what he did was actually he just gave him some drawings that he had done already. And then the lithographer had to just work off of that. And clearly he took some liberties. He got, he gave this man a shave. And he regularized a lot of these forms, made them a lot more generic, minimized the guy's like veins and stuff. But look, when you look at a print like this is an idealization. This is not what drawing actually looks like. The real drawing that it was based on looks like this. This is not a great image of it, but you can see that it's a lot sketchier, right? That it's a lot more like almost kind of lived in, you know what I mean? Like surface polish is not an important thing here, right? Also, like, look at this shitty skeleton for this. Like, this, who knows, this might have just been the lithographer. Like, but, it's like, again, none of this stuff is predicated on things being perfect, right? This is just about things being good enough and being practical, right? This isn't like an amazing drawing, but this does what it needs to do. And look, if you don't have to break stuff down into so many things, you don't. You just, simplest solution, just boom, right? Occam's razor, through and through. Anyway, again, those are sort of idealizations. You look at Yvon's actual drawings that he did as an artist working, and, there's, let's see, they look like that, There's no clean, single line little Bargue thing where you're like finessing the outline until like it's, just like absolutely perfect. No, you do something that's good enough, then you start sketching, then you look at that and that gives you a preview of like the lights and the shadows and the modeling and like the overall size. And then when you're happy with it, you start committing to parts of it and then that's it, It's nothing.
Were the Bargue,
what's that?
sorry, were the Bargue figure plates the same story where they were probably full tonal drawings that were then traced over to extract the major lines?
Oh, you know what? I think the Bargue, the actual Bargue figure setups, those were done later, and at that point, Bargue was on his own. Like it wasn't Jerome was not supervising anymore, as far as I understand. So I think those are actually just bona fide, just drawings by Bargue that I don't think actually had any. I don't think those were made from like other drawings. Let me see if I can grab those real quick. But the interesting thing about that is that those are much more akin to real drawings, because I think they actually are. Like, because you see like the kind of sketchiness in them, right? Where it's like, that's what it's actually like out in the trenches, you know what I mean? It's like, you're not going to get this like perfect little outline or whatever. It's sort of like impractical, and you get diminishing returns after a while. But if you actually really look at those Barg studies, like, I mean, this is actually probably how one could start a figure drawing. But again, with these, you know, you see like actual like construction lines, you know, like this is a good example. You know, you can see like the initial kind of mise en place, it's just like bang, bang, like that. Or, you know, things like, let's see, where's a good one here? Oh, for instance, even like the averaging out of like the arm at first, you can see that like, you know, he tried something and he was like, oh, just kidding, actually, I want this over here. You know, you can see that it's not like a one-shot kind of thing. You can see like the, you know, the lines for the, you know, the box that he's sitting on are kind of crooked. Like, that's what actual drawing looks like.
So these are plates, then those are just sketches of the books, like.
It looks like it. I mean, he might have drawn them directly on the stone, but they don't look like they're copies of drawings that are already done. These look like actual drawings. Like, look at this. I love this. Like, this is just like, first of all, it's not straight lines anymore. It's straight-ish lines. And second, it's just like, all right, just get the gist of it. Like, whoop, big swoop, you know, unafraid to put that in. And then later he can figure out the little over-under kind of thing. It's like putting the person inside like a bag or something. You know, just like a simple container, and then kind of, you know, chiseling out the changes afterwards. But again, it's like all this stuff basically hangs on this idea of making things as easy as possible, you know, not overcomplicating things. So in any case, you know, if we go back to the actual drawings that people made in Yvonne's class, they look like this. This is our boy Kenyon Cox again, right? This is like a really high-res drawing you can find online. Look, there's like actual outlines on here, which in some ateliers would not really be allowed. The background is what some would say tolerably even. It's not perfectly even, it is tolerably even because you have no business getting this close to this drawing. This drawing is meant to be seen as a whole, evaluated as a whole. And so, you know, here you got your charcoal sketching, you know, your charcoal fumbling. This is your first date with the drawing. And then you start to like solidify and commit a little bit more, right? And then, you know, then you start to actually like, you know, finally go in over here, right? Again, it is nothing if not tolerably even, right? Here's a tolerably even tone here, and here's a bunch of erasing with, you know, a piece of bread. And again, a little bit more sort of like, you know, accents with the Conte crayon. Now, this is a funny one. Kenyon Cox did not win a prize for this drawing, because that was the big draw of Yvonne's class, that you get prizes. So he didn't get a medal or anything. He wrote a whiny letter to his mom where he's like, well, because in the class, like, there were 70 people, right? You knew exactly what your rank was, you know, from number 1 all the way to like, you know, number 70. Sargent had tested in also to that class. That's where he met Julian Alden Weir. Sargent was like 37. You know, he didn't go in there and like, oh, he was top of his class and everyone. No, he was like in the middle. Kenyon Cox was also like 30 something. So anyway, the thing is that people would choose their spot and where they were sitting based on their rank. So he told his mom, he's like, well, since I was only ranked 37, like I basically had to like pick from the scraps, and I got this place where you can't even see the face, and I had a spot where I couldn't really do anything good. Also, it was medal week, so you got to like submit, you know, any drawings that you had made since the last time that medals were handed out. So these people here, they won medals that same, you know, these are drawings from the same week as the one that Julian Alden Weir did, but they actually got medals. Now look at this. I mean, this is a gorgeous drawing, you know. Talk about continuity of the forms, talk about all these forms like flowing and also being beautifully characterized, right? But when you get up close to this drawing, you want to talk about those hands? What do those hands look like, right? You want to talk about how even and, you know, carefully filled in with a little sharp nitrum charcoal those shadows are? No, they're not, because that's nonsense, right? Look at this. That's the face. That won a prize. Someone looked at that and was like, yeah, we want that one, right? What about the hair, you know? And this is, I mean, a stump is what does this. There's no other thing that does this. But basically, this was like a little helmet head with a stump, and then a couple little scratches with a Conte. Boom, call it a day, move on to the next thing, right? Same thing here. You're doing most of the work with a stump underneath, not making everything overly sharp. The paper helps to diffuse the, you know, the thing already, you know, so you don't have to manually soften the edges. And then tap, 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 you know, a couple little sprinkles with the Conte, you know, a couple scratches with the eraser, call it a day, move on. Here's another one. Again, you see some stylistic differences, because again, they weren't policing like how much Conte you use. You could make your drawing just in charcoal if you wanted. You could not use a stump if you wanted, although most people did. You know, but you could choose to put in a background. You could not put in a background. They didn't care about that. You know, but again, this guy chose to focus on the head a little bit more. You know, he had all that time not putting in the background, so okay. But, you know, you look at the foot, like, you know, you want to look at me and tell me that you couldn't make that foot? Of course you could. Anybody could. You know? And that's the thing. It's that a lot of this stuff is like the simplest possible way of doing stuff. And then you just have a lot of turnover. So they give you enough time to make a drawing that is elaborate, but not so much time that you're like fiddling around, right? And so, you know, it's that kind of thing. So anyway, the painting was treated the same way. By the way, these are drawings by some of the teachers. These are drawings by Isidore Pils. So even though these drawings are not as like annoyingly polished and pedantic as the drawings that people make today, they still wouldn't make drawings like this. Like 12 hours is much shorter than what you see at most ateliers. They would not make a 12-hour drawing after they left school because the government's not paying for the models anymore. So, you know, what you would make as a working artist were drawings like this, you know, little sketches. You wouldn't make a finished drawing for something unless you were getting paid for it, right? And so, you know, this is what those academic drawings are supposed to teach you. You're supposed to learn enough about the structure of hands and things like that that you can, you know, draw them in shorthand, pun intended, later on. Or here, look, this is a more elaborate study. He grabs his stump, right? He's working on toned paper. Again, is this the most polished drawing in the world? No. But Isidore Pils could spend that time instead making huge multi-figure compositions with like horses charging and stuff like that, right? So anyway, these are all, you know, people that taught at the Ecole at one point or another. You know, fairly simple. This is a caricature by Bouguereau. Like Bouguereau drew this like during a meeting, right? And you know, these are little noodle people by Bouguereau. Anyway, I realize we're over time. I figure, I mean, if you know, if you all are okay with it, I am happy to, you know, go a little bit overtime, and you know, folks can catch it in the recording afterwards. But you tell me. What are we thinking? Yay or nay?
I have another session coming in here.
I do not think, not for a little while.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go a little bit over then. Okay, so we did talk about the painting, in that the painting approach was pretty simple. You know, the painting approach can be best summarized by this extremely eloquent quote from Jerome, where he says. Let's see. Maybe that's in the next one. Again, you know, I went into this stuff when I first started thinking that the issue was going to be finding enough things, enough little clues about how they worked. Now, 10 years later, I'm realizing the problem is that there's too much stuff, you know? So anyway, one of the students, they went to see an exhibition of Malay's work. And, you know, the student was basically, you know, he had given way to his fancy by washing in the color transparently in the richest hues. The man's hair became deep purple. His tawny skin glowed with warm tones. When Jerome quietly stepped behind Eaton. Eaton is the student. "Do you see the color of the model like that?" queried the master. No, not exactly," replied Eaton, alarmed. For there was a shade of the severity for which the master was noted in the simple question. "I am simply preparing it in this way to paint over it solidly." "Prepare nothing. Paint," emphasize Jerome, as he passed on. So basically, like, there was no underpainting, there was no glazing, there was none of that when you were a student, like in the atelier painting your nude models. When you were a fully cooked artist, when you were doing stuff on your own, sure, you know, because painting a single nude is not supposed to be that hard, right? So you would effectively have a drawing that you would apply fixative to, or milk, or you maybe went over it with brown paint, and then you would, as Julian Alden Weir described, you would just use the paint, kind of, you know, basically the way it comes out of the tube. You put in a little bit of the background. You know, you mix up a tone for the shadow, maybe one for the half tones, maybe one for the lights, and then you just put them where they go. That's it. You know, there's no other fancy trickery to save you. It's just you, full manual, and you know, just you know, the forms of the model, right? And the thing is that this actually worked really well, right? Because you learn to not achieve the color through some kind of like special, sophisticated, or complicated process. You're not painting it in green and then painting over it in red or whatever. You just learn how to match the color, how much red, how much yellow, how much blue, how light, how dark, how saturated, or how neutral. That's it. You do that, you put down an average for the area, and then just go to town, right? And you can paint anything that way. Now, did people develop more sophisticated methods later on? Some of them, right? Because an Ecole painting is not, you know, the most elaborate painting you've ever seen. You look at these things up close and they're like, you know, they're just like the drawings. It's like, they're fairly straightforward, they're fairly simple. You know, if we look at some other examples here, let's say from Jerome's studio, or from, take your pick, honestly, but Jerome was the one with the most Americans, and Americans are the ones that documented the stuff the most. Here's another one. Look, you got, you know, one tone, two tones, maybe three, right? You got this one here by Gustave Courtois. This one was one of the ones that Julian Alden Weir bought. You can go look at it in Connecticut. It's at Yale currently. Look at how it starts, you know, 1, 2, maybe 3, and then eventually you arrive at something more finished like this. Basically what they would use after a while was a fan brush, or they would find some way of going across the form. So you can see that here. This is all done with bristle brushes, by the way. Here's a very blocky, you know, foot by Julian Alden Weir, you know, blocky all throughout here. But you can see that after a certain point, he started using a little fan brush here to weave the forms together and make them more organic. So, you know, making a person that looks like they're hacked out of wood at first is fine, but eventually you want more. And so, you know, instead of having the planes really cut out like this, you start to, you know, realize that the borders between forms in real life are much more open. So you start to go across things, you know, in the sense of the form, as they called it. A more advanced student, like his friend Dagnan, let's see, where's a good little Dagnan here? Let's type it into the search bar. Dagnan. You know, this is a painting of the same model, you know, same year, not the same pose, but, you know, fairly similar. Again, same studio. He was a friend of Julian Alden Weir's. Look at how he paints the side of those abdominals. Yes, there's that plane there, but also there's a whole lot of zigzagging across because, you know, there's the, you know, the kind of basket weave of the flesh, right? So it's not quite as cut out as some of the other stuff, right? And again, you see him like going across the form in these drawings. That is something that you could see, or painting rather, but that's something that you could see in the paintings as well, right? If you pull up some of these, and I have a bunch of these things for download on my website. If you pull up some of this stuff, what you find is that, well, this one's a little bit hard to see, but people could do any amount of hatching they wanted with the Conte on top of the stumping, you know, for whatever degree of specificity they needed. So let's say you put in the side plane of this pectoral, but then you want to come in and put in these little folds on top. You know, you might erase a little bit of this, you might darken some parts with the Conte. The Conte is like a little chisel, you know, for just like specific little bits. Actually, you know what? I have a better example for you. Let's take a look at some of these by Bussau. Bussau was a Portuguese artist that went and cleaned up at the Ecole. He just like took all their prizes, then he left. This is a cast drawing by him. So even if you were in the evening class, once a month you would have to draw a cast, right? And again, you might look at this as a 12-hour drawing, right? You might look at this and think, you know what? This probably took a long time, very complicated, all this drapery. But you would be mistaken if that's what you think. Look at this. This is literally a flat tone and then the folds erased on top of that with bread, and then some accents added with a Conte crayon, and maybe a couple little shadows added with the stumps so that they're softer. That's all it is. That's all it is. Your block-in would not include all of these little folds. It would be much simpler. What your block-in would include is the way that the fabric gets disrupted by this leg that is turning upwards, right? It would include the overall direction, potentially, of like this leg seen underneath the drapery, right? The cut of this major fold here, obviously where things start and where things stop. That's the kind of stuff you would include. Look at the hair. Same deal. You model a ball, and then you cut these little troughs into it, but you don't let those things dominate. You don't let them monopolize your attention. You only put in what you need, right? And when you go back and you look at, for example, this other drawing by Poussau, another cast, right? Again, looks very polished, looks very finished, but it is a 12-hour drawing. And so the way that it's done is you look at the torso of it, it is effectively one flat halftone and then some erasing, and then going a little darker in spots that need it, call it a day, right? The subtlety doesn't come from, making things really difficult. If you look at two areas and there's a subtle difference between them, it means they're mostly the same. So you make them the same and then suss out the differences afterwards, right? The whole point of this is like a puzzle. It's like playing Sudoku, right? You are not supposed to torture yourself with too much work. That is not the goal. There is nothing noble about that, right? And so, drawing is sort of difficult on its own. Your job is to make it easier on yourself because that doesn't happen automatically. The difficulty does happen automatically, right? So you don't have to help that along. Chaos is what happens on its own. Order is the thing that you have to sort of, generate. So anyway, you look at this and it's like not super complicated, right? None of it is. And none of these people spent longer than 12 hours drawing a cast. Some of them are downright sloppy. This is a student of Bouguereau and our friend Tony Robert-Fleury, aka Beautiful Tony. This won a prize. It's like that's the funny thing about the modern sort of paradigm. With the site size ateliers and all that stuff. It's like, well, these people that we supposedly admire seem to have pretty different standards for this stuff. This was good enough for them, right? And so, maybe we're being too hard on ourselves a lot of the time. Anyway, what was all this stuff for? This was all for the Prix de Rome. The Prix de Rome was basically American Idol for painters in France. Now, to do that, you did have to be a French citizen. Up until the 19-something, it was only open to men. A woman won for the first time in 1925. And it was like worldwide news, and she was phenomenal. Her name was Odette Pauvert. If you're interested, I can send you this website. This chronicles every Prix de Rome winner and some of the runners-up from 1864 until the contest ended in 1968. This is the winning painting in 1864, right? This is the winning painting in 1865. This is the winning painting in 1968. The Ecole was not as rigid as people think. It was very much open to a variety of influences. So basically, any kind of art movement that you can think of was at the school. It just took a couple years to sort of make it into the mainstream, right? But people think of this precipitous decline, like after World War I, this stuff just ended. Not really. They still had cast drawing. They still had all this stuff. It was just kind of like a slow sort of shift in priorities, right? But in any case, you're welcome to look through that if you want. I can send you the website. This is Odette Pauvert's winning painting from 1925, and it is a phenomenal one. So, and you can see the influence of sort of like, Art Nouveau and that kind of thing. There's a little bit of like, not influence from Leyendecker, but sort of drawing from the same pool as Leyendecker in a painting like this. But anyway, so what would happen is you and 150 to 200 of your closest friends would show up to the school on a certain day. Now, this is funny because the contest was conducted on school grounds, but it was run by the academy, right? So they were just borrowing the school's like campus. So you would get your academicians rolling up, right, in like their little hats and everything. And these people basically would like pull out I mean, they wouldn't pull out the subjects out of a hat exactly, but it was kind of like that, where no one knew, and it was very closely guarded by actual guards, what the contest was going to be, or what the subject was going to be. So it could be anything from the Bible, from Greek mythology, or Roman history. And if you didn't know the subject, well, sucks for you, right? You just kind of had to know. But to be fair, I mean, I think people see, like knowing Greek mythology and stuff like that as kind of like a far away sort of thing, as kind of like a burden kind of thing. But you have to imagine that this stuff was like, I don't know, like Marvel movies to them. You know what I mean? It serves the same function. It's the same thing, basically, right? So anyway, they would pull the thing out of the hat, and then they would put the contestants, who had to bring their own easels and stuff, into the loge. A loge is basically a cubicle, and they would have a guard there, and they would have little curtains so that you weren't cheating. They would have the loge also for the, contest to get into the evening class. So they would give you a perspective problem and lock you up. They would give you like an anatomy problem and, like draw an ulna, and then you just had to go in there and just draw an ulna, right? Anyway, but this is the one for the sketch contest. And you had to draw it on like a specific size of canvas. I think it was like 12 by 16. They would just say like, all right, the death of whoever, and you just had to know what that meant. I think they would give you like a brief explanation, but not too much. Here is another view of the loge, right, during a contest. And here is actually a color painting by our friend Kenyon Cox of what the loge looked like. And here's like a central stove heating the whole place. This is from 1884, I think. So anyway, that's what the loge looked like. You would produce a little sketch that would look similar to one of these. And again, your teachers, including even Sargent's teacher, who was seen as like really revolutionary, but the only thing they didn't do was like they didn't make finished drawings in his studio. Other than that, it was like the same as every other place. You have to make something like that. It was based on storytelling. They didn't care, you didn't have to know what drapery looked like. All this stuff was just made up. These are just little noodle people. This isn't real anatomy, right? So this is like the death of Julius Caesar, I think. This was effectively the kind of thing you had to do. Again, you probably know a little bit from the costume class about some togas and about like some Greek and Roman stuff. But, you could introduce any color effects that you wanted. This was straight up out of your head. You would get 12 hours, I think. Or was it 6? It was either 6 or 12 hours, I forget. But you'd get like that amount of time, not because it took that long to paint it, but because you weren't being judged on how it was painted. You were being judged on your ideas, right? And so stylistically, it could be whatever you want, You could load up the paint as much as you want. You could make it as, terrifying as you want. Like, that was all up to you. And you can see that some people have like impressionist leanings after a while. Maybe they've been outdoor painting because, one does not simply conjure this up out of the ether, right? So anyway, you were making one of these, you're making stuff like this, like, again, like as homework for your classes anyway. Not formal homework, but, it was like suggested that you did this stuff. Basically, no one forced you to do anything back then. So anyway, you'd make one of those, and then they would choose the top 20 people, and then they would make you paint a nude figure that was about 32 by 27 inches, so it was like 81 by 65 centimeters. And that is probably what that, well, actually, you know what? We won't even deal with probably. I'll show you one that is exactly from the contest. This is a nude by Georges Moreau de Tours that is at the Petit Palais now. This was, it's inscribed in the back. It's from the Prix de Rome contest, the second trial in 1878. This is what one of those paintings would look like. So you and, 19 other people would be locked up, and now you had to paint a figure, and you were being judged on basically like, how much it looked like the model and capturing the pose and all that stuff. This loincloth was added afterwards. If you want to see, how I figured that out, there was a lot of comparison of, crotch shadows between this one and this one, which is clearly the same model. If you're interested, you can go to my Instagram, and there is a story highlight called Art Detective that you can find that explains the whole process. But basically, this is by two contestants that were in the same 1878 contest. This one's misattributed, and it lives in China, even though it's literally signed by Danyan in the front. So it somehow ended up in the hands of one of his mentees, who one of whom was the father of academic painting in China. But anyway, so you'd have to make something like that in 28 hours. You got 4 days, 7 hours each day. So it was kind of like a grueling marathon for everybody, including the model. And then once you passed that trial, what they would do is they would take your sketch from the first trial and your painting from the second trial, and they would judge them together and pick 10 people out of that. Sometimes 8, but mostly 10, right? So they'd pick 10 people, and those 10 people had to move into the school. You had to bring all your shit and move into the school, and you were going to be there for 36 hours. So what you had to do in that time is they would pick out another subject out of a hat, basically, and this is it was like a whole occasion. They would take photos before they locked you up. So anyway, they would give you a subject, and they would give you 36 hours in which you could not leave. You had to go to the bathroom in there, I think. They didn't want you to cheat, basically. So they wanted the composition to be completely original, completely yours. They didn't want you to have your friends pass you a note or something, or maybe you run to the Louvre and look at a Titian or something like that. They did not want that. So, for instance, for those two paintings that we just looked at from 1878, those two people, Moreau de Tours and Danyan, moved on to the next stage. And the next stage was actually, the subject chosen that year was Augustus Caesar, then known as Octavian, visiting the tomb of Alexander the Great, which is actually the subject of the painting that I'm doing. I didn't have academicians pick it out. I had people on Instagram choose, but basically same thing. So what you would do is you would get the 36 hours to make a sketch like this. This is the one that Danyan made. Now, it's not because it takes 36 hours to make a drawing like this. It's because it takes 36 hours to think of a good idea. Because you were locked in after that. So they would come in, they would give you a sheet of signed and stamped paper that you had to make your drawing on. Then they would bring you tracing paper, and you had to make a tracing of your drawing. They would keep the tracing, you would keep your drawing, and basically you could not really deviate from it that much. If you changed up your composition over the next 71 days, it was 72 total minus 36 hours. So over the next 70 odd days, if you decide that I'm going to change my mind and completely change my composition, you are disqualified. So better luck next year. Because the thing is that, again, they didn't want you to go and, because over the course of those 70 odd days, you can come and go. It was like a job. You would clock in, you'd be given a studio, you'd work there, and then you would leave at night. And so they didn't want you to go to a museum and get a better idea or whatever, right? So you had to stick to what you came up with, and people did. This is the sketch that Danyan made, and here's the painting that he made. You notice, they try to keep the sketches pretty vague because that allows them a little bit of leeway, but the major features of the composition are the same. But how much of this did people do out of their heads? About this much. It's not like they just knew everything, just out of their imagination. By the way, this is a Prix de Rome loser. So was this one. That's a shot of the same one. I think this one's gorgeous, but yeah, this one did not win. This one didn't win. This one lives at the Musée d'Orsay. That's actually where I first got the idea to try to put myself through the same trial. Here's the sketch for this painting. I mean, again, only as much effort as necessary and no more. So anyway, once you were set, they would give you like a little stipend, so you could hire models. They would lock you up in like a, fairly small room. And, you'd have your props and your models, and it was time to get to work. So here's a guy, top hat off, posing as a Roman soldier. Here is the student working on his Prix de Rome painting. Here is a more disheveled looking student with his painting smock, full Roman cuirass in the back, with like the little leather skirt thing, and a mannequin. A mannequin, just tied up here, serving as, this is a Priam and Achilles painting. So here is King Priam begging for his son Hector's body from Achilles. Here are the, the students' various tools of the trade. Sorry, what's that? Oh, I thought we had a question.
Okay.
So anyway, again, and this might be where the guy peed. I actually don't know, but it looks suspicious. Anyway, but again, these things are also not that glamorous. Like, look, this is for Augustus at the tomb of Alexander. The mummy is a chair in this instance, right? This is Gelone, a very famous model. Here's a model taking a smoke break indoors during one of the sessions. Here is Emperor Claudius, and here's a final painting showing the same model as Emperor Claudius. Here's Gelone taking a break. Here's like a Prix de Rome painting in progress. He got hired for this a lot, So in any case, and here's what I used to. This is basically like me for the last couple of months. It was just me in the same position with my two boys. But in any case, the way that this stuff ended up working was, again, I decided against, any kind of better judgment that I was going to try to do the same thing over the last summer. Now, I'm an actual adult, so finding 72 days continuously is kind of hard. But I think it's been spread out over a couple of months, but I think we are still on track, as far as the painting goes. Basically, what I found out over the course of this and teaching a workshop on this, teaching people how to do it and documenting what I've been doing, is that basically half of this stuff is done with a mannequin. If it's clothed, a mannequin, it's a very good bet that that's what it is, right? And they were much more easily available at the time. I ended up making one out of like effectively trash and office supplies. You can make one for like $100. It's actually not bad at all. And you just rig it up with ropes and stuff so that it does what you want. It's a lifesaver. Back in the day, this wasn't practiced as much during the period we're looking at, but during the time that like Jerome was a student, Armitage talks about this. People would make more maquettes, right? So they would make like a little clay maquette. It doesn't have to be fancy, right? But you can see Lord Leighton, who was not a French painter, but he was educated in Italy. So a lot of the same stuff applies. Make little wax or clay figures for one of these elaborate paintings, because these people are just people. They can't just make stuff up out of nothing and have it look convincing. This is what you would do. This is the easiest way to do it. The more you can make it like playtime, like you're a kid playing with Lego or something, the better. And you have to actually inhabit these characters. This one actually survived. This is like what one of those mannequins look like. But painting and all this stuff is not about technique. It's not about like, how you apply the paint or whatever, any more than, when you look at a page of Shakespeare, it's not really about like the little squiggles on the page. You know what I mean? It's about the content. And so this is from a manual by this painter, Aron. And here you go. He is describing how to make a little wooden box with like, colored, I think it was like cellophane and like a little candle to figure out how to make this painting, right? That's what people did it. They just made little miniatures. And so in any case, I've been doing that. I was doing that for the painting that I've been working on. And it is really fun. It's like really, really fun, actually. So, I had some images of the stuff that I put together. This is how the mannequin started. It's made out of out of cardboard tubes cut to size. Here's Meatball and doing quality control. It's got a bunch of wires in it to be able to move. And I mean, it took about a day to build the prototype and then a little bit longer to flesh it out. But, this monstrosity at the end is actually pretty good for drapery. Doesn't get tired. You can set it up in whatever lighting you want. Scares the neighbors, prevents home intruders from coming in. It's great. So in any case, there was that, and then I did make like a little maquette. Again, the maquette doesn't actually have to look good. It just has to give you a starting point. That's it. And I tell you, like, this is so much fun. It's so much fun. This is like a box of like wood polish. These are paper towels covered in like a mixture of glue and water, so I could like move the folds and just they would harden. These are just like little clay people made with like the cheapest clay possible. And this actually helped me to like kind of like rotate the scene around and kind of decide on some things that I wanted to do. I ended up making some Roman armor. That was really fun. It's made out of a t-shirt. It's basically a corset. It's a t-shirt with some wires running through it, a bunch of tape to shape it, and then a little bit of drawing, more duct tape, some drawing for the patterns, a little bit of clay, and then just a bunch of spray paint and a lot of glue, a lot of like Elmer's glue. Cooper inspecting these Roman sandals, these faux Roman sandals that we got at Goodwill, and made a bunch of mummy parts using parchment paper and more glue. And I mean, the amount of glue that was consumed during this project, this painting is mostly glue, The oil paint part is very minimal. This is fake leather from Amazon. So it is a vegan-friendly project. Honestly, like, I would hire models for basically like the naked parts, like the arms and stuff like that. This is my friend Matt, who posed for the figure of Augustus and did a phenomenal job. And basically most of my job was, oh, that's weird. Okay, doesn't want to open that. But here we go. This is what it was like when he was posing. So, the armor and the tunic and all that, I wasn't gonna make him sit there. It was like during the summer. I'm not gonna make him sit there, with all this like nonsense on him. So I just like moved the mannequin into place later and put the stuff on him. And this was like the stand-in mummy at that time. This is 2 pillows and a head. So yeah, it's gone through a few iterations. Let's see. There was like a whole process with like transferring the drawing. I basically made like a little color study. I made some drawings of the models, did a little like perspective check where I drew through everything just to make sure that all the stuff made sense, check the perspective afterwards. But it didn't start this way. It was like literally just a freehand sketch where I was just kind of screwing around, and then, you only put in as much math as you need afterwards. Took it to Staples, blew it up. The boys did their final inspection. I'm doing it at about 4 by 5 feet, which is pretty close, slightly bigger than the regulation size back then. Meeple had to jump in also. This is a dual cat inspection for this. And by this point, I had painted, I had a bunch of drawn studies of Matt, and I had a couple of painted studies. So the final painting was not painted from life, it was painted from the studies. Because painting from life and getting positioned on a really big painting is a huge pain in the ass, and it's not really conducive to very like solid, confident painting, because the model's always moving, right? And so what you do is, it's almost like working from handmade photographs. I did some studies for the form, which the values don't have to be the right values. This just has to show me how the form is built. Then the color studies have all the information that has to deal with value and saturation and hue. So basically, when it's time to paint, I mix up the base colors based on the color study, and the form studies tell me where to put them, right? Now, of course, I did a little bit more drawing onto the canvas. Like, I had my idea on the canvas of what I wanted stuff to look like, and this is a cohesive composition. These little studies of little bits, I can't necessarily follow those just on their own, because maybe that's not the pose that I wanted, And so what you do is you take what you already have and you flesh it out using the studies that you made for the specifics. So I already knew where I wanted that arm. I just made a little noodle arm, but then I get to sub in the specific details of a real arm. And, you know, ditto for Jim's head and all of that. Because a model usually can't hold a pose as extreme as what you want if you want something really active. So in any case, I rigged up the mannequin. You know, it's not pretty. It's just a bunch of ropes and a bunch of stuff pinned in the back. And that's my final sketch. Transferred this stuff to make the little painted studies because I didn't want to have to draw this twice. You know, so it's all pretty practical. The studies are also like pretty small, so I can hold them in my hand as I'm working. And I have done some stuff that's been, you know, sort of from like painting it directly from the setup, but that's fairly rare. It's like, that's more for like almost like still life type of things. So for instance, like the mummy, I've been basically painting, I did a drawing for it, but I didn't do like color studies for it because it was just kind of sitting there. I don't know how well you can see the painting behind me, but I took a couple pictures during the break so you can see at least some close-ups. And if you're interested, my Instagram is where I'm documenting a bunch of this stuff. I'm going to be posting a lot more of it later. But, you know, basically right now I have you can see behind me, I have the mannequin set up. I'm going to put it on the model stand pretty soon, and that's going to be modeling for this drapery here. Here's the mummy. You know, came out very mummy-like, so you know, happy about that. These are fake flowers from Michael's. These are blankets. That's a curtain. This is gold paper that they sell at Michael's that I just made a little bracelet out of. And here's the armor that I ended up making. You can actually see it behind my head, right over, oh wait, no, that's the palette. It's behind the mannequin somewhere. But yeah, that's what that ended up being used for. Here's the fake leather from Amazon. This is another curtain. I have a basket ready now in the living room that's gonna get used pretty soon. And you know, when you get up close, you notice like this stuff, the painting of it is not like terribly complicated. It's not like there's like 5 billion thousand different color notes in here. But that's how these paintings work, you know? If you go and you look at a real Prix de Rome painting, just like the drawings, they're not terribly complicated. You know, even the way that this stuff is painted, you probably have more detail in your studies than you put in the final painting. And again, having the studies is useful because, you know, why not just do the painting directly on the final canvas? Well, A, you're potentially going to change your mind. B, if you mess up the painting here and all you have is like what you painted on the canvas, you have to start over. But if I don't like what I did from my drawn or painted studies, I can wipe this out and I still have my drawn and painted studies to go back to. So I don't have to like necessarily bring the model back for any of that, right? But look, if we, let's see, the last thing we'll go over here. You know, when you look at one of these Prix de Rome paintings, here's one by Luc Olivier Merson. This is like an actual like winning painting. Oh, let's see, where'd it go? Got that in here. It's from 1869. I'm gonna open that up. This is the Soldier of Marathon. You can kind of see what conditions these were done under. For example, let me direct your attention to the fact that this is the same guy who is also over here because they only had so many models. These three guys are the same guy. That's why these arms are here so that you can't tell, right? This dog, I think, was actually made from like a sculpture because they had a bunch of Ecole stuff. They have this like really creepy anatomy lab or anatomy museum at the Ecole. Rumor has it they even have like a model that died and didn't have a whole lot of family and they just put the guy in formaldehyde, but you know, who knows? These figures in the back might be made up. Like I could see these being made up. These don't look like actual people. These are definitely made up back here. It's just like making a movie, you know, where it's like the sets in the back are just like, you know, kind of not really like, you don't have the budget for that, you know, but you actually have to hire actors for like this stuff. The perspective makes no sense in this, by the way. So that was a thing that Ecole students were not always the strongest in. Again, they stopped making maquettes, you know, at around like mid-century. And it kind of shows. Like, the paintings that are earlier than this don't really have this kind of problem very often. But anyway, so this painting, the reason I brought it up is because this one is extremely well documented. And so, oh, we should open this up too, actually. This is, there's some gold nuggets in this one. The reason why I'm bringing up the Prix de Rome, by the way, is like, this is what the training is for. You don't just draw casts just to draw casts. Whether you wanted to make a large multi-figure painting like this or not, you were being trained to be able to do it, right? And so, Luc-Olivier Merson was a student of Peele's. He was a very good student, highly decorated in class. And again, this is how he drew once he left school. Like, basically everyone works out their own individual way of drawing from the knowledge that they extract by making those academic studies. But all this stuff is way faster. Like, these are not even 12-hour drawings, right? This is like, he's the one paying for the model now. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's much more abbreviated. Look at this egghead, And this is someone who was like teaching at the Ecole later on. Like, again, when people look at those, drawings that start from like a little, egg for a head or whatever, they might say like, oh, that's drawing for illustration or animation. No, it isn't. That's just another part of your training as a fully fleshed out academic artist, right? You are a designer, and so in any case, I mean, look at this. This is not a drawing from when he was a student. This is a drawing that serves a different purpose. This is made up out of his head. You got some noodle people in here. He doesn't just know what the drapery looks like. You know what I mean? Like, he has to do actual studies for that, right? But when he's doing a little sketch like this, the movement is what matters. The arrangement is what matters. Anyway, so Luc-Olivier Merson did these studies that are for that, the painting we were just looking at. And his family, I guess, like, I don't know if it was at his death or what, but they donated the studies to the school. So here. So we actually have like pretty much a complete set of at least the drawn studies. We don't really have, there's probably some painted studies, but we don't have those. But it's still extremely instructive. When you pull this stuff up, there's no, only straight lines, bar drawing, Nitram charcoal, whatever going on here, right? This is just a drawing in black chalk. It's a pretty small drawing. It's this lady right here, right? Oh, and here, let me be able to put these side by side. Yeah, so it's for this lady right there. Again, the drawing is almost kind of diagrammatic, right? And this is generally the thing that you would paint from. Look at that hand. Does that look like 20 hours of work to you? And like, check this out. But the thing is that all these things are like that. Like, look at this guy. It's like, is that the most elaborate drawing in the world? A fully shaded whatever? No, it isn't. But there he is, made it into the final painting. Like, the amount of these that look like anime characters is actually kind of wild. Here's Master Roshi from Dragon Ball. But yeah, I mean, like, a lot of these got transferred and were used in the final drawing, and these are not, like, again, the most, like, these are not the most naturalistic, like spending 100 hours with graphite drawings that you've ever seen. But look at how it's painted. It's like, that's pretty attainable. It's like basically like one color for the flesh overall, made like one for the shadows. These things are not as complicated as people think they are, right? And the issue is that people usually look at these things in a really tiny picture from far away, but when you get up close, you're like, wait a minute, this is not like as superhuman as it might initially seem. You want to talk about the proportions on this guy? Or like the size of that thigh? Like this like tiny little girl has, like longer thighs than he does, right? And again, that got changed afterwards. Like, nothing has to be perfect. It doesn't, right? And so what I found the most kind of like life affirming about this is it basically, it's like painting for the rest of us, you know what I mean? It's like painting where it's like, oh, this is a cure for perfectionism in a lot of ways. Because you realize that, like, you can have a bunch of stuff that's like kind of just whatever, and it only needs to be as good as it needs to be to get you to communicate with your viewer. And frankly, I've found this like to be liberating. I mean, look at that. That's not like, you know, look at this guy.
It goes back to the thing about like anatomy and everything, right? Like it needs the floating of it, right? So if you made everything perfectly elaborate and precise, that would actually probably take away from some of.
I mean, it might. You know, the thing is that there is nothing in a drawing or a painting, in a composition, that these artists were not willing to sacrifice if that worked out better for the ensemble, the overall thing. If you had to summarize French training to one word, it would be ensemble. It is like they care about the whole thing. So they're not going to be like counting little leaves necessarily or counting little knuckles. They care about how the whole thing looks, right? And if the whole thing looks good, that's it. That's a wrap. Here's another Prix de Rome painting. Didn't win, but, you know, still made it into the top 10. Oh, hold on. Got to go back to the... Still getting used to this new software that someone recommended to organize my files. But yeah, here we go. Okay, so Prix de Rome painting, pretty standard. But what does the main figure look like? She looks like that. That's it.
Wow.
This is a top 10 candidate in 1869, right? That's it. So it's like, what are you stressing for? You know? That's what I tell myself that all the time. Look at the drapery, you know? And the thing is that, like, there are some that are more impressive than others, but like a lot of these are kind of silly. Like a lot of them are, right? Even when you look at like a Bastien Lepage, which is very impressive in a lot of ways, the scale of these is like kind of nuts. This guy's, you know, on his knees, not even facing the angel. You know, he's like looking this way. And the thing is that he lost, by the way, because he set this at the wrong time of day. Like, the angels appeared to the shepherds at night, I think, and he set it at dawn because he thought that it would be too dark. You can actually see him doing it, because here's the nighttime scene, and here is, you know, when he changed it. And actually, he was buddies with Julian Alden Weir, too. So Julian Alden Weir is actually the one that writes about this. He's telling his brother about it. So, in any case... The thing with the guy that won was actually this guy, Léon Comer, which, you know, again, a pretty good painting. But were all of these paintings like absolute bangers? No. Here's someone else. You know, it's like I mean, okay. You know, it's not like the greatest painting ever made. You know, this is all right. Like, this one's not like, you know, really that like. I wouldn't say that's like the most impressive thing I've ever seen. You know, this guy's got just like noodle shoulders, right? And like, you know, look at the sheep. So again, you know, it kind of, these are the sketches that people did, by the way. This is the sketch for this one in particular. People usually wouldn't win on their first try, by the way. They usually had to like, you know, have a couple shots at it. So in any case, you know, Dagnan got, you know, sad/mad after he lost, so then he made whatever this weird face is on Achilles the next year, and then he surprisingly didn't win again because what is this, you know? But yeah, I mean, look, this is one of the prep drawings for it, you know? Again, this stuff is not as rigid as people think it is. And when they do think that it's rigid, it's because there isn't like a lot of research. But when you actually look into it, it's like, it's more attainable than you might think, and I think that's something that I like about it. Here we'll close up with a few, just like, again, you know, what I would consider very reassuring close-ups. So here's a painting that won the Prix de Rome. I think this is Gaston Dix, and maybe I'm mistaken, but like a few of these people would win the Prix de Rome and then die immediately after. It happened like a few times. I forget if he was one of them. Like a couple guys like died like on the way there, which is really sad because one guy tried like 5 times and he finally won, and then he just, I don't know, just keeled over as soon as he got there. But there's a sort of like, you know, absurdity to, you know, to all of this. But anyway, so this painting won in like 1880 something. I think 1889. How much work is in this head? Not a lot, you know. How about this drapery, this like, you know, perfectly delineated drapery? Oh wait, no, he's literally just dragging a brush with like 2 colors on it over the whole thing. You know what I mean? It's like you got a color for the shadows and you got a color for the lights, and this is literally just him dragging the paint like dry brush to get the... It's like he's taking a pencil, you know, like a white pencil over it. Again, in class, you're working just like mixing every color, you know, mostly separately, at least the big ones, right? And you're just using straight paint and whatever. You're making your Prix de Rome painting, you do whatever you want, you know? Because this is a more elaborate painting. There might be a case where you paint something and it's like almost what you want, but it's too dark or it's too light. Then, yeah, you would use a glaze for that, because what are you going to do? Paint the whole thing over? No, you don't have time for that. So again, it's an intensely pragmatic way of approaching this stuff. Again, if you look at some of these figures back here, like, you know, this is less work than most people put into their figure paintings, you know, in most instances. Or if you look at this guy over here, most people would not let this leave their easel with, you know, like the colors being that jumpy. And yet, you know, look at the hat. The hat is literally just 1 stroke of red and like a couple, 3 brush strokes. Okay. And that was that, you know? I mean, I think that when I'm painting this thing all the time, I know that I've done too much, like more than I needed to in a bunch of instances, and I'm just letting that be, you know, a sort of learning experience. But look at this. This is like, there, you know, most people, if they do like an alla prima head in like an open workshop, put in more work into a head than this guy did. You know? Why? Because it's a secondary character, it's small, it's in the back, but also, you know, your attention is supposed to go here. And at the same time, it's like, you know, you only have so much time, right? And the thing is that sometimes your enjoyment in a project, you know, it does kind of cool off after a while, right? And so, again, this is basically a kind of painting where, like, you don't have to work so much against your brain and, like, sit around feeling bad because you're not as disciplined as some imagined person that you made up that doesn't exist. You know, it's like a sort of very human, you know, way of approaching this stuff. I'm using this as inspiration for that basket that I'm going to have to paint, you know. Maybe I don't have to, you know, go ham on every little bit of the basket. Again, you look at the drapery, it's like not terribly complicated. And again, it's not the only painting that's like that. You know, pretty much all of them are like that. Here, this one has fewer figures, so maybe you can afford the luxury of elaborating this guy's arm a little bit more. But I guarantee you this is just a mannequin. You know, it's like, this is, you know, basically, you know, this right here is the setup that, you know, this other thing was for, right here. You know, here's Achilles and here's King Priam or Priam. You know, something like that. That's how you get character interactions too, by the way. You know, you're not going to get like someone, you know, tossing another person over their shoulder. You know, but you can do that with a mannequin. You know, you're not going to have a guy holding another guy by the throat like this for your musketeer painting. But a mannequin, you could do that. It's not too bad. So, anyway, you know, I hope that was helpful. You know, just to kind of get a more realistic view of what this stuff, you know, is actually supposed to be like. And here, we'll close it out with this. This is from Corrales Duran. And again, there's a bunch of articles about this. You can read it at your leisure. There's he had some really great insights, by the way. Here he's talking about like comparing the head of the model with that of like your friend, so you can see the difference in the character, right? The character of this man is that he has very strong arms, but is flat on the chest and the body generally. You know, you have rounded him equally all over. So you notice like their concerns are more about like, you know, sort of like what you can learn from this study rather than like copying every little shape, etc. You know, it is the looking out for the 36,000 inessential details that leads you to neglect, you know, what do you call like the broad halftone? Basically like the overall color of something, you know, but I think that can apply to a lot of things, those 36,000 inessential details. It's missing the forest for the trees. But the final note here, this is Corrales Duran, waxing philosophical. What is Romeo? What is Juliet? It is not by reproducing this or that scene of Shakespeare's drama that you can paint these creations of his genius. It is in presenting them in their most striking aspect that you best convey the idea you have formed of them. If you represent only the griefs, the tears, the death of Juliet and her lover, you give but one phase of their existence. You have not expressed them. Before all and above all, they are the expression of love. Love with all its youth, its ardor, its heedlessness, its apprehensions, and its delirium. Right? Storytelling. That's what all this stuff was for. Right? And so, in any case, like I said, I hope that that is something that is helpful, and that as you continue to pursue your academic training, you kind of keep your eyes on the prize. Don't sweat it if you don't remember the distal phalanx of whatever the fuck. Maybe chill out a little bit. Maybe think about maybe think that these people weren't always perfect in what they were doing, and then that's okay. So, anyway.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And if you all if you want any of the links or anything, or if there's anything that I forgot or whatever, let me know, and I'll send the stuff to Nate. If you have any further questions or anything, let me know. And if you want to continue to see the progress of these guys back here before my cats destroy it, then it'll be up on Instagram sooner rather than later.
That was excellent.
Yes, thank you, Ramon. If there's any questions after the fact from students, I'll be sure and forward them. But I'm just so thrilled that you took the time to give us this presentation, and I got a lot out of it. I know the students.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Well, my pleasure. Yeah, and again, I'll send you the links. There's too much stuff to read about this actually, but a lot of it's very juicy gossip. So
Yeah.
sweeten the pot a little bit. All right, thank you so much for having me, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, take care. Bye.